right. Well, I guess let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. So my name is Dr. Rebecca Mears. I'm from the VIN Foundation Student Debt Education team, joined here by the really group. We're really excited to bring this to you tonight. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get kicked off. So we'll have you use the chat for any technical issues and questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to use the Q&A. You can ask questions anonymously in the Q&A. You can also upvote so that we'll know which of the most important questions, the questions that seem to hit a number of people, and we'll try to prioritize those live. And then we'll also answer some additional questions at the end. So questions throughout. We'll be doing the drawing for those that did the homework for the Yeti and Rumple blanket about an hour or so in. These usually do take a little bit of time to get through all of the material and questions. So thanks for hanging in with us. And then I was going to see, Alexia, did you want to say any welcome from SAVMA or anything that anyone needs to know?
I'll just say, welcome to SAVMA. My name's Alexia. I'm the current SAVMA, or former, I guess, SAVMA veterinary economics officer. And we're just happy to be able to partner with VIN for this webinar. They've been super helpful throughout the VEO. We've been having a series of financial webinars, and they're always happy to present for us. So on behalf of SAVMA, I just want to say thank you. And I think that's everything. Thank you.
Yeah, a huge shout out to SAVMA. Thank you so much for helping us to put this event on. It's always really exciting to be able to reach more of the students than we normally talk to. I would say, I know we see a number of you at different lectures and things like that. So just awesome to be able to connect more. All right. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Let's get kicked off here.
Cool. Thank you, Rebecca. I just wanted to shout out to the VEO elect, I believe is Jennifer, right? So she's the one that initially kind of arranged this. I know she's on clinics and can't join tonight, but just wanted to give her a shout out for initially arranging all of this tonight. So we've got a lot to cover. Thank you to everybody who did the student debt and income signalment form homework beforehand. I learned a lot from those. I've been working some of that into this presentation tonight, and we'll see how far we can get in terms of the content and answering any questions that you have. There's been a lot of changes with student loan repayment. I think we finally have kind of a good handle on what this is going to look like for you when you get to graduation, presuming things don't change any more than they're already scheduled to change. But we've also got a lot of time between now and when you graduate to cover that I think a lot of students kind of gloss over, right? So I saw a lot of first year, second year students register for this event tonight, and there's a lot of borrowing left, and we need to talk about interest and what interest rates might look like and how you can set yourself up for repayment success between now and when you graduate, no matter how far away you are from graduation. So I do have one poll that I'm going to pop here just to see who is in attendance. I saw also quite a few 2024 folks that had registered. So because thanks, and this is great. So I see quite a few 2024s as well. We're actually going to be doing a special new grad student loan repayment playbook for the 2024 class that is going to be specifically catered to some of the challenges that you guys are going to face. Now, there is a lot of overlap between what we're going to talk about tonight and what you should be doing as a 2024 graduate, but there are some special unique things too that I'll try to remember to mention as we're working our way through here. But that's not the primary focus of tonight's session, right? So it's more kind of a 2025 and beyond is really what I was planning to cover. But again, since I see quite a few here, I'm going to share what the results are. So since I see actually almost a predominant number of you are 2024 grads, I'll make sure to include some of the things that we've been seeing and talking about with 2024 grads on the student debt message board over on VIN in terms of things that you might be able to do ahead of time to try to tweak your loans a bit to make them even more beneficial for you as you're getting started in repayment. So clearly a lot to cover tonight with regards to student loans. So we'll dive in here, and I'd really kind of rework this year and trying to make it more of a, what's coming up and how does it relate to student loans, right? So no matter how far away you are from, whether you're first year or knock on the door of graduation, graduation's coming, right? And that's going to be super exciting. You're staring at whatever that first gig is for you after graduation, whether that's an internship, residency, private practice, what have you. And then repayment's going to start shortly after you graduate. If you follow some of the recommendations that we're going to talk about tonight, really want to focus on those first 2 years of repayment, because that's where you can really make the biggest difference. And one of the other things I think students particularly get wrapped up in is looking way too far down the road, right? Like worrying about, well, what does, paying my loans to zero look like? Or if I'm going to hit forgiveness, what does the tax look like? And those are things that could be decades in the future, right? So I really want to pull back from that a little bit and focus more on what can you do in those first 2 years that is consistent for everyone to help you jumpstart your overall financial wellness and put yourself in the best situation to repay your student loans, whether that's reaching forgiveness or paying the balance to zero. Those first 2 years are going to look very similar for everybody, right? With the exception of that 2024 class, because there's some active changes that are going to happen this summer that we'll talk about tonight as well. Year 3 to 5, again, we're probably not going to cover this sort of stuff, but we'll make sure that there's a link to this presentation. But I do have some content for that does cover that sort of thing, but that's probably not where we're going to get to tonight. So, but tonight, we have to talk about, for especially those of you that are not graduating, you've got more loans coming. That means more interest. What does that look like? So we have to touch on the borrowing aspects, especially as they pertain to interest, now that interest is a thing again, right? So for those of you that are graduating, your interest has been turned off for a really long time and just got turned back on, this past October 2023. But for those of you that just started in the fall, you're going to see your interest accrue, for the duration of veterinary school, right? It's kind of like it used to be before the forbearance benefits started. We're going to talk about preparing for repayment. In that respect, it's going to be very apropos for those of you that are graduating in 2024 and beyond. We've got the student loan grace period that we're going to have to talk about, right? Because there's always a lot of misconception and confusion around what you should be doing with that student loan grace period. You're also likely moving. Most of you aren't going to remain on the veterinary campus that you're currently residing in. And then you're going to start being a veterinarian, right? Doing some doctoring and learning how to become a great veterinarian. You'll have to have a budget. It looks like about half of you told me that you have a budget now, which is excellent, but your budget's going to definitely change from school to new grad, right? So whatever that, having a budget in school is really helpful because it develops those habits for helping you to build and maintain that budget. And then it's a lot easier to adjust. Once you get done with school, you find yourself in your new living arrangement, your first job, earning money. What does that new budget look like, right? So it's easier to transition if you've already got a budget from school that you're bringing with you to that first DVM gig that you're doing. I'm going to encourage everybody, again, exceptions here for the 2024 class, but most of you are going to want to start with the new SAVE repayment plan, right? And so it used to be called Revised Pay As You Earn. It's now called SAVE. It's got some more bells and whistles than Revised Pay As You Earn had. But for the most part, everybody here, except for maybe a handful of 2024 grads who could potentially still have access to Pay As You Earn before it goes away, you're going to want to start with SAVE, right? And we'll talk about why that is. SAVE, and some of you might even be able to start with SAVE before you graduate. And that's kind of one of the mad scientist options that I want to cover tonight with you guys as well. This is also more about financial wellness than it is just about your student loans. I do find that students, for the most part, get so wrapped up in their student loans that they forget all of the other things that go into their financial wellness, right? So emergency funds, retirement savings, saving for a home, starting a family, vacation funds, enjoying your life. All of those things have to coexist with your student loan repayment strategy. And the good news is that they can, right? So you don't have to forfeit anything just because you have student loans, no matter what the amount is, right? And that's what the overarching goal is of dealing with your student loans. All right, so you can't manage what you don't measure. So we're going to take a look at your student loans. You really need to know what you're dealing with, and that's going to kind of set the stage, particularly for the 2024 grads, knowing which repayment options you have available is going to determine which ones you should choose or how fast you should act after you graduate. Interest, it's back on, right? It's here, it sucks. But we have to deal with it. We have to know how to treat it, right? There's good, bad, and even ugly ways to deal with your interest while you're in school and even after school, right? And I think if you try to treat your student loans like you would any other type of debt, you're going to fall into that bad and ugly category, right? So we have to understand how our student loans behave, and then we can approach repayment in a much more efficient, effective way. We're going to talk about the student loan physical exam. That's what we do. That's what Becca and I do to try to help our colleagues understand what their options are and basically how you can work through changes that are thrown your way, right? So whether those are career changes, family changes, even arguments with your student loan servicer, these are things that you can usually better understand a solution for once you do a good student loan physical exam. So we want to make sure everybody knows how to do that before we leave tonight as well. We'll talk about student loan repayment. Again, we've kind of already introduced it. You want to put that SAVE repayment plan on your radar no matter what your student loan balance is, right? So, and I'm going to work in some of the comments that you guys asked, right? This was my favorite, right? I have no idea where to start. It seems very overwhelming, and that's exactly why we're here tonight, right? So to try to start peeling back the layers and make it less overwhelming. Being behind on savings for retirement and balancing loan repayment with savings, I mean, you have to figure out a way to do this, right? I mean, it takes a long time to become a veterinarian. Most of us are late to the savings game as it is, so we can't postpone it any longer just because of our student loans, right? And good news, again, you don't have to. How much of your income do you put towards your student loans? Again, the repayment plans that are available largely do that math for you. You have to understand the differences between them and pick the one that's going to be best for you. But again, good news, if you want to, there are a whole suite of options that allow you to pay based on a percentage of your income. So if you have very little income for a little while, your payments will be very low or even zero. If you have a lot of income, your payments will be a percentage of that a lot of income, right? But it'll always be that same percentage. And that can be really helpful in terms of planning. Or you could choose a time-driven plan, and those time-driven plans are based off the amount that you borrowed, right? So it doesn't really factor in how much you're earning. So that can be appropriate for some people, but generally speaking, using one of these income-driven plans, particularly in the first 2 years after you graduate, no matter what your balance is, will help you jumpstart your financial wellness and not have you pay any more towards your student loans than if you tried to approach them aggressively right out of the gate, right? So that's where understanding your options and the strategies can really help you save some money and start all of those other financial wellness items a little bit sooner rather than later. Right. So even this comment, this is why I included this one, there tends to be this idea that just because I have a lower amount of student debt and less than 100,000 for a veterinarian is a relatively small amount, you can still benefit from an income-driven plan, right? You may not hit forgiveness, although there's still a possibility that you would. You probably won't, but you can still use the income-driven plan strategically, and it won't cost you any more to pay back your student loans. Not now, not with the new SAVE plan. And that's where we really want to make sure everybody understands how that works. How to pay in order to maximize paying off the loan with as little interest as possible in as little time as possible. This is, I hear this a lot. It's not very realistic. The one option that actually probably fits this outcome is public service loan forgiveness. Right, if you want to pay the absolute minimum towards your student loans, then look into public service loan forgiveness, right? Because most people who go right into some kind of public service loan forgiveness eligible position after graduation and satisfy the 10 years required right out of the gate will pay way less than they borrowed in most cases, right? So the only one that really fits that goal is public service loan forgiveness. Now, there are a lot of public service loan forgiveness opportunities in veterinary medicine, but you may have to seek them out, right? And it may not be what you were thinking you were going to do right now. So otherwise, it becomes a bit of a balance, right? In order for you to pay your loans back with as little interest as possible, you pretty much have to write a check for the full amount at graduation, which if that's the case, you probably wouldn't be using the student loans, right? So, there's everything else after that is a balance between how much do I have to pay, how much can I afford to pay, what repayment options are available to me, and what does my career trajectory look like, right? And that's where it starts to get a little bit messy. All right, I'm going to use my student loans to kind of illustrate concepts and topics just to talk through this and show you how I approach student loan repayment. It also shows you why I do this. You certainly don't have to take the same approach that I take, but it's going to be very useful in explaining what this looks like. But before we do that, I'm going to dive into as well just a big picture of what debt and income looks like, at least the latest data that we have from the AVMA. Well, this one I thought was interesting. Earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, I met with the incoming first-year class at UC Davis, and I asked them to. I'm going to actually ask you guys the same question before I explain this. So in the chat, tell me one word that comes to mind when you think about student loans. Right, this was the exact question that I asked the incoming class of 2028 at UC Davis. What is one word that comes to mind when you think of student loans? Yeah, and this was kind of what I saw from them too. There's a lot of really heavy, dark words in here, right? And it's hard for me to believe that you guys would have applied to veterinary school at all if that was really behind having to use student loans to pay for your education, because 90% of veterinarians use student loans to pay for their education, right? And yes, it is stressful. Most of it, I think, comes from not having maybe the knowledge to deal with it, but the same could be said about practice too. I mean, seeing that first patient by yourself without a mentor standing next to you is also going to be kind of scary, right? But your student loans are not going to be debilitating, right? You're not going to be in repayment for forever. I see, shackles, hell, restricting. They don't have to be if you don't want them to be, right? A lot of those are choices that people make, right? To make their student loans become shackling for them, right? And now you're going to see this a lot. And this is really kind of the take-home message that I want everybody to walk away from tonight is your federal student loans are the most flexible but annoying debt you'll ever have, right? But the flexibility is really the key there. And it really is helpful, particularly for most veterinarians as they're getting started in student loan repayment. So we are going to take a clinical approach to this. I mean, think about your student loans as like a complex internal medicine case, right? My wife is a veterinary internist, right? She sees complex internal medicine cases all day long, right? And student loans are kind of similar to that, right? I mean, it's a long-term, like treating a long-term chronic disease, right? There's going to be good days, there's going to be bad days, but they all kind of lead to the end goal, which is, in this case, a zero balance, right? So you can use a good student loan physical exam, what we find tonight on that, and apply some of the concepts that we're going to talk about, and you'll find that student loan repayment is not going to hold you back in any manner from anything that you want to do. All right, so when we talk about student debt, we can't exclude income either, right? Because it's kind of the income or lack thereof that usually makes dealing with student debt more difficult, right? Or at least more difficult in a traditional repayment sense. These are some of the latest data points we have from the graduating class from 2023. We can see that student debt as a whole has come down. Now, my sense is a lot of this has to do with the fact that we shut interest off for nearly 4 years, right? Veterinary school certainly hasn't gotten less expensive, right? But we did shut off interest, which had a huge effect to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars for people, right? But that interest switches back on. And the 2024 class has less debt than most graduates. 2025 will have a little bit more, 2026 a little bit more than that. 2027 is going to kind of be back to what we used to see before the pandemic, right? Where you'd have a full amount of interest accrued during veterinary school, right? So it's going to come back up just by virtue of having the interest back on as well. The income numbers are very healthy though too, right? So yes, the debt is what it is. And a lot of these will depend upon the school that you're attending and whether or not you're a resident or non-resident, if that's a state school, or if you're attending a private school that has a kind of a flat rate, right? A lot of those numbers are going to be kind of baked into the equation based on your residency status or the school that you chose. The magnitude definitely matters, right? I mean, if you're sitting in, and this is where I see more veterinarians get in trouble, right? Because once you get out of school, there's a lot more mixing, but we can still see this during school as well, particularly at the state schools where you have residents and non-residents, where your classmate sitting next to you could be paying half as much as you're paying, right? But when you get out and your colleagues that you're working with as veterinarians, you know, maybe one attended a school where they were able to graduate with $100,000 of student debt, and you attended a school where you graduated with $350,000 of student debt, right? And those repayment pathways are going to look very, very different, right? So it's not going to be like you can just do what they're doing to pay off their student loans. Likewise, it probably won't make a lot of sense for them to do what you're probably going to do to pay back your student loans, right? So we have to be very careful when we talk about student loans in terms of blanket statements and, you know, what's the best way to do it. It really depends upon your circumstances and where you fall on this income spectrum as well. So good news, you know, this is a pretty steep line, and it's been heading in that direction for the last several years. Hopefully that continued increase in demand for veterinary services is on that same pathway, and we'll see those starting salaries become even higher. We've seen the internship salaries get yanked up a little bit higher too lately, so that's pretty good. So you know, there's still a huge difference here between what an intern earns versus what a private practitioner earns. So you have to be aware of that if you're graduating, heading into an internship, maybe in the hopes of doing a specialty after that. Some of the other really positive signs we're seeing, signing bonuses are a thing, right? That's really cool. We're going to talk about signing bonuses, or maybe we should talk about them now, right? What do you think you should be thinking about doing with that signing bonus, right? How about in the chat, let me know, do you think you should be using that signing bonus to pay off your student loans or to put towards your student loans? I see an I don't know, some of it, a lot of no's, a few yeses. A few more yeses, partial. Not at all. Depends on your plan. Teach me. Yeah, I would not. Right. So I would steer clear of that. Your signing, but those signing bonuses are really retention bonuses, right? And you haven't stayed there long enough yet, right? So if they're designed to keep you with that employer for at least a specified period of time, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a lot of turnover in veterinary medicine, meaning that a lot of people change jobs fairly frequently, particularly for those that have recently graduated. And that's very expensive for employers. So if they can incentivize you to stay by getting you to sign, you know, or offering you a signing bonus, then that reduces those costs and it improves hopefully it improves their clinical performance by keeping more people there longer. Right now, you have to be very careful about those signing bonuses. Not that they're bad or you should avoid them, but you have to read all of the stipulations that are attached to them, right? In most cases, if you leave that job before 1 year, 2 years, whatever the contract says, you have to pay some of that back, right? And if you put that towards your student loans, and for whatever reason you need to move, whether it's for family reasons or, you know, unexpected reasons, whatever the case is, you can't get that money back to pay back that signing bonus, right? So I would not. I don't think I've seen a case yet where it makes sense for someone to use their signing bonus to pay down their student loans, right? So what I would really do with that is use it, you know, put it to start your emergency fund, but you really kind of have to just tuck it away into a savings account until you're clear of all those hurdles where that employer can it's called clawbacks, where they can take that money back from you if you leave before reaching that specified period of time, right? So I wouldn't use that money not only for your student loans, but for anything. Like I wouldn't go out and buy a new car with it, right? I mean, again, same kind of issues apply, because if you are in a position to have to pay that back, it can get pretty precarious if you haven't cleared those particular hurdles. So again, and you don't have to put it toward your student loans, right? We're going to talk about ways you can make sure you have a $0 payment on your student loans. Well, the Department of Education will cover your interest, and you won't have to worry about making a payment in those first couple of years, or at least maybe get you to the point where you're beyond what those signing bonus hurdles might be.
Talking about signing bonuses, there's a question in the Q&A about those are taxed more heavily. And I was wondering if you could also expand on that. If you do find that you leave your position within that clawback period, what happens with the fact that that bonus has been taxed?
Yeah, usually they'll take the taxes out of it, right? If they don't, then you're going to have to allocate a certain amount to pay those taxes at the end of the year. But if you leave within the year that you received it, even if they took the taxes out of it, you have to pay the tax amount back as well, right? So if you leave too soon, you could be in a position where you have to pay back the full amount, even though you didn't even receive the full amount. You received the amount less taxes, right? So again, it's one of those really weird quirks that you usually don't learn about until you try to walk away before you're clear of those signing bonus hurdles, right? But if you do, it can be really, really messy, right? So make sure you read all of those stipulations very, very carefully. You have a really good sense that, I think it's quite unlikely that I'm going to end up leaving this place before, I clear all of those particular hurdles, and then be really responsible about how you use that signing bonus, right? I really don't think you should be doing anything with it, but sticking it into a high yield savings account, at least until you clear some of those initial time hurdles. All right, so just kind of looking at how I approach my student loans. This is part of kind of that student debt and income signalment process, right? So I'm a veterinarian, my wife is a veterinarian. Together, we have more than $400,000 of student debt. If we wanted to pay that back quickly or as fast as possible, or using a 10-year plan, which I saw a lot of you hoping to do with your loans, the amount that we would have to pay, the minimum payment, would be based on the amount we borrowed plus the interest rate, and whatever that minimum payment needs to be to extinguish that balance over that 10-year time frame, right? So that would have been $4,500 a month for us, right? And that's probably not in the cards, right? And again, this is a pretty high balance because we have two veterinarians, but again, those time-driven plans don't care what your income is, right? They only care what the balance is and what the interest rate is, right? So you can run into some issues pretty quickly there. And as we did, we would have loved to have paid it back over 10 years, but we would have had to move in with our parents, right? And that was something that was just not going to happen, right? So instead, we stumble upon these income-driven plans, and there's been a variety of them. Income-based repayment was an earlier version. You can see the payment is much lower than it would have been under a standard 10-year plan. Revised pay-as-you-earn came online a few years after that. We switched to that plan because it significantly reduced our monthly payment. Then we had the pandemic forbearance benefits, which shut off payments, shut off interest, still gave us credit towards forgiveness. It was a huge financial boon for those of us that were using income-driven plans during that pandemic forbearance period, particularly for veterinarians, right? Because there was a huge spike in demand for veterinary services. That's where we saw incomes increase, but we didn't have to pay towards our student loans, right? But we're still kind of maintaining our status and actually reducing the amount of time that we'll have to be in repayment, or at least maintaining that time. We won't have to be in repayment any longer, but we're not making any payments towards those loans. And these are some weird quirks, weird benefits that you have with your federal student loans that most people don't even think about, right? But that was a huge, we didn't have to pay nearly $1,000 a month for 4 years. That's a pretty good bonus, right? So I mean, some of these things just happen, right? Now nobody could have seen that happening, but I was certainly glad that I had kept my loans in that federal system up to that point. And now we're in a plan called SAVE, so repay converted to Save. It's got some new features. Everybody that was using Repay before automatically got put into Save. You guys can choose to use Save. That seems to be the plan that they want everybody to use. It'll probably be the best plan for most people, at least to start. And you know, it can work quite well. And the way these income-driven plans are set up is you make payments based on a percentage of your income, and your family size factors into that equation for a specified period of time. For Save, you make payments for no more than 25 years. If you have a balance remaining when you hit that maximum repayment period, or 25 years using Save, that amount will be forgiven. And depending on what the rules are in place, you may or may not have to pay a tax on what's forgiven, right? So we're planning as if we have to pay that tax roughly 13 years from now, and we're 82% to our forgiveness, projected forgiveness target. So the tax we would have to pay on forgiveness with 13 years to go, which basically means we're ahead of schedule. Right. So, and this is a snapshot. I just took this right before the session, right? So this is a snapshot of my forgiveness savings plan. It is using a platform called Wealthfront, which falls into the category of what are called robo-advisors. So these are kind of automated programs that are based on algorithms. You pick a risk tolerance, your investing risk tolerance on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being super conservative, like a savings account, 10 being let's roll the dice, I'm going to throw it all in the stock market, right? And you can pick your scale, and then you give it money essentially, and they allocate that across a diversified allocation of investments that meet that risk tolerance. I would say ours is probably set at somewhere between a 7 and 8 on the risk scale, because we got a long time until forgiveness, right? So we started this probably 9 years ago, this particular version of it, and we've got 13 years before we hit forgiveness. We've got some time to weather those ups and downs that you can obviously see happen when you invest anything in the stock market. This dotted line represents what we've contributed. This dark solid line is the value of the underlying assets, right? So the difference between here and here essentially is not our money, right? It was a capital, it's a gain, right? We haven't realized the gain yet, so we haven't had to pay any taxes on it. But the bigger this difference is, the less of our own money we're actually using to pay that tax when we get to forgiveness, if and when we do have to pay that tax. Right. So it actually can reduce the amount that we pay towards our student loans in total by taking a long-term approach and, you know, saving for the forgiveness in this manner. Right. You can see we've earned roughly a little more than 10% annual return over this time frame, which has been really helpful in terms of, you know, planning for that potential tax, assuming that we do have to pay it. And this, again, conceptually is where a lot of people get in trouble. For those of you that use an income-driven plan and are likely to reach forgiveness, the temptation is to pay more, right? Pay more than your income requires. And unfortunately, it has the opposite effect of what you would think, right? It doesn't actually help to reduce the total amount that you pay. If anything, it ends up being mostly or entirely wasted, right? So it doesn't pay to pay more than the minimum, particularly when you're on a path to hit forgiveness. So it brings me to kind of my next question for the chat. You know, why don't we, let's assume I told you we've got about $400,000 of student debt. Let's say that this account has $100,000 in it. Why, just to keep the math simple, why don't we just cash that in and put it all towards our student loans, right? Reducing it from 400,000 to 300,000. Any thoughts on that? That money won't be forgiven now. Tell me more about that, Natalie. That money won't be forgiven now. Almost wasting it. Just know it's bad. Hard to explain. It is, but it's a core concept of here. That that $100,000 can be invested and worth more over time. That's definitely true. Right here, Taylor's got the answer there. So still have to pay the tax. Right, that's the answer, right? If I reduce our student debt from 400 to 300, it is quite likely, highly probable, that even with a $300,000 balance in 13 years before we hit forgiveness, we're still going to hit forgiveness, which means I got to start this all over again, right? I just voluntarily paid $100,000 more towards my student loans. Sure, I might have reduced the tax towards the end, but I still have to now start this savings account all over again, right, to reach whatever that new projected tax target is, right? So I ended up paying $100,000 more towards my student loans than I needed to, right? So it just doesn't make sense to pay more than the minimum when the forgiveness actually ends up being a huge discount in the end, right? Especially based on how we tax things in this country. So yes, taxes are scary, but if you have an idea of what that target is going to be and a long time frame to reach it, you can hit it, right? No matter what your student loan balance is, as long as you're diligent about it. All right, so let's talk about the student loan physical exam, right? So federal student loans, most of you have federal student loans. This is what you guys told me, right? So it's pretty typical for veterinary students, 90% of you with US federal student loans. This is a pretty good chunk with health profession student loans. So 20%, that's pretty high. Health profession student loans are typically those types of loans that are available at state schools, right? So that's great if you have those. Those are still a type of federal student loan and one of the major ones that no longer or do not accrue interest while you're in school. So these are excellent if you have them. And if you have never heard of them, ask your financial aid office how you might be able to apply for them, because if you can get them, they're some of the only loans that are left for veterinary school that do not accrue interest while you're in school. Parent Plus loans, these are loans that usually your parents take out on your behalf to pay for your undergraduate education, right? Unless you're the parent who has taken those out for a child that you might have who is in higher education or has been in higher education before. The Parent Plus loans, interestingly, are in your parent's name, right? They may have been for your education, but they're in your parent's name. So they're technically the responsibility of your parents, right? Now, they may expect you to pay those back, but they're still tied to your parent's name. Right, so if you have Parent Plus loans that you're planning to pay back on behalf of your parents, you really need to take care of your student loans first, right? At least make sure that you're staying current on your student loans before you start tackling loans that are not in your name. Right? I know it sounds weird, but that's just how they're set up. Right? So anybody that has Parent Plus loans that is confused on how to pay those, I'd point you over to the VIN student debt message boards and ask those there, because we can dive in a little bit more deeper and see if we can come up with a good plan for you to take care of those after school. Private loans, that's actually a pretty good chunk of private loans. I don't normally see a lot of private loans. Private loans are usually from undergrad as well, right? Because there's limits on what you can borrow for undergrad federal student loans. And a lot of times you make up the difference with private student loans. Sometimes those are co-signed by your parents or some other family member to get those private student loans. Private student loans are unfortunately not as flexible as federal student loans. So if you have the opportunity to be very careful about this, right? But if you have the opportunity, you have a little bit extra federal student loan funds that you receive each semester that you know that you're not going to use, and you have private student loans, you can try to kind of swap out some of those private student loans by using your federal student loans to pay off those private student loans. But you don't want to get yourself into double trouble, right? Where you end up burning through your federal student loans to get through your semester, because you paid them towards your private student loans, and now you're using credit cards to make up the difference, right? That would not be a good idea, right? But private student loans, to the extent that you might have some additional federal student loans left over that you can use to pay down some of those less flexible private loans, you might want to look into doing that. Again, you're going to see this a lot tonight, right? Federal student loans, super flexible, super annoying, right? But don't overlook them or don't bend over backwards to avoid them, right? They're still the most flexible debt you're ever going to have, right? And you're only going to have access to them while you're in school. So if you have the ability to use those to extinguish some less flexible debt or to help set yourself up for repayment or navigating, advanced education, those sorts of things, use them. All right, federal student aid website. This is something that you definitely need to get familiar with. Studentaid.gov, you guys are probably all pretty familiar with this because you have to go here to fill out your FAFSA form. But it's also where your student aid data file lives, right? So we're going to make sure that everybody knows, it was, I asked you guys on that Signament form if you were able to grab your file, and you tell me yes, but then there's very few of you that actually included in the Signament form. So I'm just going to make sure that everybody is aware about how to find this particular file, because we're going to use it as kind of the core of doing your student loan physical exam. So they make you confirm all this information pretty much all the time now, which is really annoying. But it's really good, particularly when you graduate, you want to make sure that you have your address and email and all of those things up to date, because they're going to communicate with you that way, right? And there's certain things, particularly if and when you consolidate your loans, that you don't want to miss, right? So making sure that your name, address, phone number, email is all up to date in the student aid system after you graduate is really, really important. All right, so here's my share of the overall student loan balance. This isn't really enough information for me to make any decisions, so I'm going to hit this view details link. But one of the other things that we've been talking about a lot lately on the student debt message boards is this My Activity feed, right? So when you submit a consolidation or when you apply for a repayment plan, all of that stuff is going to show up in your activity. Right. So a lot of times people submit those and are like, oh, I don't remember what it said or what I included on the form. You can pull it up usually in this My Activity section. So that's another relatively new, super useful area of the studentaid.gov portal. So here I'm going to hit the view details to try to get to my student aid data file. It's going to take me to this next dashboard aid summary page. And this is the button I'm looking for. Right, download my aid data. Now, you may not see this on an iPhone or a very small device, but if you're on a, hopefully some kind of laptop or something where you're able to save files, you can click this button, scary language. It'll allow you to save that as a text file. And that's, you want to keep it in this TXT format. That's the text file is what you're going to use when we come over and enter that into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool, and eventually show you what the in-school loan estimator and loan repayment simulator look like as well. Let's actually do that. I'm going to come back here. Let's show you what this looks like, because this, all of you, especially those of you that are graduating, because you guys are done borrowing, right? So you're not going to have a lot of changes to your student aid file between now and when you officially graduate, right? So grab that student aid data file and upload it while we're here. Right, that applies to anybody, right? Because this is a great time to ask questions about what you're seeing, especially when we start talking about these income-driven plan profiles. So this is the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center, publicly available. Anybody can use it. Everybody does use it, but it's designed specifically for veterinarians and veterinary students, right? And if you're a VIN member and every student has free access to VIN, right, you can log in, right? I'm going to do that here just to kind of show you what that looks like and why. It helps us to tie that file to your account, right? So if you ask questions about it on the student debt message board, you can see there's a link here directly to the student debt message board area. I'll take you there in a little while too, to show you how you can get personalized help from Becca or myself on your student loan questions. But it also, again, it kind of logs what you're doing on here. So when you ask us questions, we can find your file, we can see that file, we can see that information and help you and help answer those questions that you have about your student loans. Only Rebecca and I can see that stuff, right? So that's not something that everybody has access to. It's just access that we have on our end to be able to help you. When you start uploading files in here, it'll start kind of collecting them. You can see I've uploaded a few. That's how you can pull that information up. This would apply more for maybe a fourth-year student, right? But your file is going to change if you're not done borrowing, right? Every semester that you receive a new student loan, your file is going to change. Every month, it's going to update with the amount of interest that you have, right? Because the interest is accruing. So we've got a lot going on in your file. So, just because you upload one tonight doesn't mean that's the only time you have to do that, right? You're going to want to keep doing that as your circumstances change or as you add more data to that file, like taking on more loans. All right, so again, those of you that are not graduating, you're still borrowing, right? So I have student loans with more to go in this bucket. So we'll upload. I've got a couple of examples here. Let's see if if I can find them quickly here. So this is a good one. This is a first year student from Ohio State that just started borrowing for vet school. So their file is really, really simple, right? There's only 3 loans in it, right? And we could see the difference between the loans, right? So Stafford unsubsidized, Grad Plus loans, you're only allowed to borrow up to this amount, and then anything you need above that falls into that Grad Plus category. We can also see that there's a difference between the interest rates, right? The monthly interest that accrues on these, right? So this is just kind of helps to establish what you're going to see in there. You'll see your loan servicer, Advantage in this case. Probably the most important piece of information that we're looking for in here is the income-driven repayment eligibility, right? We're going to talk about income-driven plan profiles. Right? It depends on when you started borrowing and the loan types you have will determine which of these income-driven plans you're eligible to use. This constellation of plans I call income-driven plan profile 1. Right? This is the most flexible of any of the income-driven plan profiles. Right? This is kind of what you want to see. Now, if you see something different, right, it's just going to mean you have a few less options, right? And that's going to depend on what your file shows, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. If you had an alert pop up too, you're gonna want to pay a lot of attention to that. But this is kind of how we do this initial student loan physical exam. We're looking at the types of loans you have, when you started borrowing, which plans you're eligible for, the overall average interest rate, what things are looking like for you, right? And then we can send that over to the in-school loan estimator. This person actually provided an excellent in-school loan estimator link to illustrate what this looks like, right? So you would send this over and start building that, but I'm going to actually just bring this over using the link that the student provided. Right. And you can, that's the cool part of this is you can share these links, right? So if you have questions about them, you can post those in the student debt message board area and we can use that link to help answer those questions. Right. But if you've got 3 years left to borrow, right, and we have to assume that we're borrowing some amount of money going forward at some amount of interest rate, we can get an idea of what our graduation balance will be with that interest accruing. Right, and this is really the big difference between, say, a first year graduate, first year that's going to graduate in 2027 versus somebody who's graduating in 2024. Right, this interest number is going to be a lot higher, again, because the interest is going to be accruing for the full duration of the program versus a 2024 grad who had interest turned off for 3/4 of the program and is graduating with maybe, $5,000, $8,000, $10,000 of unpaid interest. Right, so these are just some of the differences that we're going to see in the files going forward. All right, so when it comes to what you can do if you're sitting in that seat where you're still borrowing, right? So first, second, third year, what can you do now to set yourself up better for repayment when you get to graduation, right? Because there's things that you can do now. And I think there was some of you that had posted some questions and concerns about, I used to take less, but now I'm finding that even if I take a little bit more, I'm not able to get through the semester with just the student loan amounts, and it bothers me to have to take more. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where it's like federal student loans are the most flexible debt you're ever going to have, right? Don't avoid them. If there are still loans available for you to take and you're having a hard time getting through your semester using your budget, then take more. Right? Take up to the amount that is offered to you, and you do have some time to return those funds if it turns out that you borrowed more than you need. Right? So what I would recommend that you do is open a savings account. Right? So not separate from your, spending or checking account. Open a high yield savings account. Right? And there's a link to this, and we'll make sure to post this actual presentation that you can use the links that are in here and click through it again too if you want to, along with the recording. But this is bankrate.com. It's kind of like NerdWallet. This has been around since I started using the internet. So it's kind of my go-to. But these are all the online savings accounts that are yielding really good interest rates these days, right? And they have zero minimum balance requirements, right? So you want to pick the highest yielding online savings account that has a zero minimum balance requirement and put that living expense refund in that savings account, right? And then you can set up monthly or bi-weekly transfers from that savings account into your spending account to cover your budgeted expenses, right? And that kind of puts up a barrier between your spending account and the money that you receive to cover that expenses during the semester, but it also allows you to earn some interest on that student loan money. Now, it's not enough to cover all of the interest that you're being charged, but it's a heck of a lot better than putting it in a spending or checking account that's yielding you 0.01%. Right. So you can defer a lot of that or defray a lot of that interest expense on your student loans by moving that living expense amount into a savings account, earning some interest on that amount, and then transferring over what you need into that spending account. If and this is another trend that I've been seeing students recently, is more and more credit card debt. And it could have something to do with inflation. Maybe they haven't adjusted the living expenses amounts enough to cover your living expenses now. I'm not really sure exactly what is causing that, but credit card debt is really expensive and it's not flexible, right? So again, coming back to that idea, if you're not taking student loans just because you think student loans are terrible, right? Credit card debt is way worse. Right, so anything that you can do to get yourself out of credit card debt and stay out of credit card debt using federal student loan funds is much better than relying on those credit cards, right? Carrying a credit card balance is really, really dangerous stuff, right? Those interest rates are really high on credit cards right now. So trying to eliminate that credit card debt and not using them except maybe in an emergency scenario is really where you want to get to. Speaking of emergencies, don't forget your emergency fund, right? Every student should have an emergency fund. Maybe stash away $1,000 in that high yield savings account that you're keeping just for those unexpected expenses, right? There's a family emergency and you have to fly home this weekend and, you're going to have to pay a pretty stiff airline ticket. You want to do that without having to carry that on a credit card balance for the next 6 months. Right. So you can use your student loan funds to build an emergency fund, right? I'd rather have federal student loans in my emergency fund charging me interest than using a credit card or relying on a credit card for an emergency fund. For those of you that are graduating, don't forget your post-graduation moving expenses. Again, most of you aren't staying on campus, right? It's expensive to move, right? Make sure you have enough of a buffer to get yourself from graduation to your first paycheck. Right? Student loan funds can really help bridge that gap. You have 120 days from the time you receive your loans to return them, and the interest and fees associated with that amount will also return with it. And so rather than, taking all of the money or using that money to make payments on other federal student loans you have, return any amount that you borrowed in excess of what you need. And 120 days covers nearly the entire semester. Right. So if you think about it from this semester, so if you got your student loans in January, you have almost until May to decide, oh, wow, I've got $3,000-4,000 of living expense amounts sitting in my savings earning interest that I can return in that 120-day window, and it'll return the interest and fees associated with that amount. Right. So don't forget about that 120-day window, right? So you can keep that money because you're not sure if you need it or not, right? But make sure you set a reminder in your calendar before that 120-day mark to return those funds, to return the interest and fee associated with it. Okay, that leads me to my next poll, which is student loan interest. Should you pay interest or borrow less? Great. Looks like Allison already asked this question. Do you recommend paying interest while in school, or is it better to wait? Yeah, so this is kind of that poll that is going to answer that question. So it looks like 80-20 of you, right? So this one actually has a correct answer, right? Borrow less, right? Paying the interest is not going to help you reduce your amounts, right? Because you accrue interest every day, right? So you may pay that interest for that day, right? But it's going to accrue again tomorrow, right? But if you return the amount, it returns the principal, or you borrow less. You have a lower principal, and the lower your principal, the less interest you'll accrue. Right? So it doesn't make sense to pay the interest during school. Right? This particularly applies to those of you who have older loans from before veterinary school. I see that all of the time. I see people that take federal student loans for veterinary school. And they're like, oh wow, look at all the money they gave me, and they take some of that money and they pay off their undergraduate loans that have an interest rate that's half as much, or might even be subsidized and not even accruing interest. Right? You're not gaining any ground by doing that. Right? You're just replacing that money with more expensive graduate school student loan money. Right? Do not pay the interest. Right? You will end up graduating with a lower balance if you borrow less instead of paying the interest. Right? So focus more on that 120-day window than in returning less and leveraging that budget that you have than making payments towards interest. How do you return the amount? Is there a way to do that online? So I would double check. The safest way to do that is through your financial aid office, right? Some of the financial aid offices have special protocols for you to follow to return those funds. Technically, the loan servicers, if you make a quote payment to a loan that you received within 120 days, that should be reflected as a return, right? But the loan servicers suck. All of them suck. They're terrible, right? So I would not rely on doing that. I would double check with your financial aid office and see, can you tell me what your recommended protocol is for returning funds that I want to return within that 120-day window. All right, so more on student loan interest, right? Again, because the majority of you still have some more loans to come, and interest is kind of a bigger deal than it had been in prior years, right? It's just one of those unfortunate realities that we're dealing with. So for the most part, you guys are going to start with these unsubsidized loans. When you hit these limits, then they satisfy the remainder with these Grad Plus loans. So one of the things that makes your federal student loans so flexible, especially these direct loans, is that they're eligible for income-driven plans. They're eligible for public service loan forgiveness. They have special discharge provisions if the worst should happen to you, things that a lot of other debt do not carry. The nice thing about these health profession student loans and loans for disadvantaged students, they are a type of federal student loan. They can be consolidated into a direct loan after you graduate, which makes them eligible for all of these benefits. Right? And the nice thing about these health profession student loans is they don't accrue interest during school. So if you can use some of these health profession student loans to reduce the amount of these Grad Plus loans or these direct unsubsidized loans, then you're doing the best you could possibly do, right? Because you're replacing these amounts with an amount that doesn't accrue interest. You'll actually have a lower balance when you get to the end of school. All right, next poll. What do you think the interest rates are going to be? Oh, I need to stop sharing this one. What do you think the interest rates are going to be next year? So next year being, for those of you that are borrowing after July 1st of 2024. So for most of you, that's starting next fall. All right. Thank you for answering those. All right, so the answer is going to be, unfortunately, higher. So the masses have it there. So your student loan interest rates are determined by the 10-year US Treasury yield. And the 10-year US Treasury yield, and this is what it is today, right? 4.26. And they take this essentially on some day at the end of May or June, and they add 3.6 to it, right? So let's get out our handy dandy calculator, and we're going to say 4.27. Oops, got to put a point in there. 4.27 plus 3.6 is going to give us 7.87. Right, 7.87 is going to be the interest rate. If they were set today, 7.87 would be the interest rate for the direct unsubsidized loans. The Grad Plus loans are always 1 percentage point higher, so it would be 8.87%. Right, so they're going to be higher, right? And I don't know exactly what it's going to be yet. Hopefully, it'll stay below 8% for the direct unsubsidized loan. Right, but it's probably going to be one of the highest interest rates that we've ever seen on these types of loans, right? And it's just a factor of kind of the macroeconomic environment right now. And hopefully for this next year, they'll be a little bit lower, but that really remains to be seen, right? But we do know that they're quite likely to be higher than they are right now, and that we'll know that in about 2 months, what those rates will actually be. Which brings me to my mad scientist alert. So who knows, I'm dating myself here, but this is one of my favorite all-time movie characters. Anybody know who this is? I sometimes
Christopher
forget.
Lloyd.
What's that?
Christopher Lloyd.
well, sure. But I meant the character. Does anybody know what character is? Yeah. And
You've got lots of answers. You've got lots of answers here.
Well, that's great. That means I'm not as old as I think I am. So that's wonderful. Yeah, Doc Brown is one of my favorite all-time movie characters. So, and this is from Back to the Future. But whenever I think of, mad scientist, I think I've used this as a Halloween costume more times than I can remember. So this is something that's kind of been introduced in the system in the last year. And anybody who's willing to take advantage of it, please reach out, because I think we may be able to help reduce some of the interest while you're in school. So for anybody who is falling into the Grad Plus category, which is most veterinary students, or if you have unsubsidized loans that have already been in repayment from before veterinary school, I think you can get those particular loans into the new SAVE plan. Right now, there is some risk associated with this. This isn't like all rainbows and pot of gold kind of thing, right? But if you can get that loan or those loans into the SAVE plan while you're in school, it's going to save you a lot of money, right? Because this is how they calculate the interest. And from the example that we used in the My Student Loans tool, this person, and let me come back over here. I think it's this one. Yeah. So when you're in here doing your student loan physical exam, click on the loan types tab, right? If you have direct Grad Plus loans, right? These ones that are 8.05%, or at least they were this particular academic year, right? These are the loans that are really expensive, but you can see that there's a differentiation in their repayment plan, right? And this is just a weird quirk of the system where your direct unsubsidized loans are reflected as being in school, and you technically can't put loans that are in school in repayment until they're in their grace period. But these Grad Plus loans act a little differently, right? They're in this persistent state of deferment, or they put them in repayment, but they don't make you make a payment, right? And that means that they can be put into repayment. Now, before last year, they really hadn't been letting you do that, but there have been some students and graduates that have returned to school that we found are able to get these Grad Plus loans into a repayment plan even while they're in school, right? So if you can do that and you can get those loans into the SAVE plan, then that will save you. Let me come back to the presentation here. How many days, months are in veterinary school, right? It's about this, right? So this works out to about $12,000 on just this loan, right? And this person is going to receive at least another 3 Grad Plus loans. All right, so this could be a significant amount of savings if we can get this to work right. right? So, but it does require you to kind of be willing to give it a shot and be willing with the potential side effects, which could be that, you know, you're going to have to continue to apply each time you get a loan, right? You're going to have to make sure that they stay in repayment and they don't get pushed into deferment again, which could actually end up capitalizing the interest on your loans. So there are some side effects, but if you're feeling kind of, you know, willing to go for it, then let us know, right? So this is the student debt message board area. I alluded to this when I was talking about using the Student Debt Center. When you're logged in, you'll have a link here and you can post in the student debt message board area, right? Maybe some of you guys saw the alerts, right? But you can actually post in here and you can post anonymously, right? So if you want to read more about student loans, there are thousands of these cases in here, your colleagues all trying to figure out how the best way to pay back their student loans, right? But if you want to post some questions in here, this is how you can do it. You could even post anonymously. There's an anonymous box. We'll know, Beck and I will know who you are, but the rest of the community will not. Go ahead.
There was a question there while you were talking about the your mad scientist alert, and it said, does it apply to new loans being taken on a yearly basis?
Does it apply to new loans being taken on a yearly basis? I think, you know, I think that's kind of what I was alluding to before. You're going to continue to receive loans, right? And those loans may not automatically be put in repayment until you tell them to or apply to have those loans put in repayment. That's why this is not for the faint-hearted, right? This is going in recognizing that you guys know how busy vet school is, right? You're going to have to be diligent enough, at least, you know, 2 times a year that you get your student loans, to check in and look at them. Are they in save or are they in some other status, right? And if they're in some other status, then I need to submit another application to get them into save, right? So you're going to probably have to do this twice a year until you graduate, or more, depending on how your disbursement history is, right? That's the cleanest way it happens. You receive a loan in the fall, you receive a loan in the spring, you know, rinse, wash, repeat until you graduate, right? But some of you sometimes receive part of your loan in the fall, and then you'll receive another part of that loan later in the fall, right? So every time you receive a new loan, you may have to apply for save again, right? So otherwise, maybe only some of your loans will be in repayment and the other ones will be in the deferment status, still racking up interest, right? So that's part of the side effects that are kind of potentially part of this process, and why we would love for you to kind of post on the boards so we can coach you through this, and periodically you can check in and we can say if it's working or not, right? So this has been a pretty small sample size so far, but I do think that it can work, and I think it's worth trying given how much those interest rates are for this particular academic year, and they're going to be higher for next academic year, right? So anything that we can try to do to reduce that interest, I think, is worth a shot.
Yeah, and that's something that's really new. So we're really looking for the people who are willing to try that now as the first group. Somebody was asking if there was anybody that's already participating in that experiment. There was also another question about if this could apply to possible public service loan forgiveness. I wanted to see if you could touch on that currently.
Well, it depends, right? So public service loan forgiveness is its own beast, right? And having your loans in repayment is one of the requirements, but you also have to be averaging at least 30 hours per week working for a qualifying employer, right? Most of you are probably not, right? Not while you're a student. That would be very, very difficult. Right, but if you are, then yeah, you could start logging some public service loan forgiveness time, at least on the Grad Plus loans, right? This is another one of those differences. Like you're not going to be able to get all of your loans into that status, right? It's only going to be a chunk of them. But for the Grad Plus folks, that's the most expensive chunk, right? So again, that's why it's worth, you know, giving that a shot. The only people I've been able to see successfully earn public service loan forgiveness credit while they're in school are folks that have finished veterinary school and returned to get a master's of public health and are still working in their current job. Right. And that's kind of where this came from. Right. So these are the folks that have demonstrated this to be possible. So, and this relates to the one-time count adjustment, which is a whole different morass that most of you don't have to worry about. But since they're borrowing new loans and they had old loans from veterinary school, they have different forgiveness clocks, if you will, right? They have different amounts of repayment time. And there was a way for them to consolidate some of those loans from that Masters of Public Health and get them into the SAVE plan, and then get that public service loan forgiveness time added to that new consolidation loan, and increase that time and shorten the duration of repayment for those loans. So that's where this is coming from, right? So if it works for them, it should theoretically work for you too, right? Now, all but the part that, when you're a student, you're not technically an employee, even though it might feel like it, right? Unless you can demonstrate you actually have a job at some nonprofit or 501c3 where you're working an average of 30 hours per week, you're probably not going to get public service loan forgiveness time while you're just in veterinary school. I realize that a lot of that may not make a lot of sense, but for those of you that want to give it a shot, we'll try talking you through it. All right, so when it comes to choosing a repayment strategy, the best is not always the fastest, and the fastest is not always the cheapest, right? And this is a kind of a unique feature of your federal student loans. Once again, federal student loans are the most flexible but annoying debt you'll ever have, right? So just throwing a whole bunch of money at them as fast as you can is not always going to have the outcome that you're hoping for, right? For most other debt, it can, right? But for your federal student loans, it doesn't necessarily incentivize that, right? So it's just how they're set up. You can fight it, and I watch a lot of people try to fight this, right? But eventually they kind of give up, and they're like, all right, it's better to work with the loans than to try to work against them, right? And it has to do with how they're set up. One of the other things that, and this is from Paul Pyan, the co-founder and CEO of VIN, likes to say, life is what happens when you're planning it, right? And where we see this play out particularly relevant for this group is that about 60% of veterinarians are not working in the first practice that they accepted a position with after graduation. And most of them had changed jobs within 1 to 2 years after graduation, right? This is that turnover I was talking about, right? There's a lot of turnover in veterinary medicine, and particularly in those first couple of years. Right. So, you have to kind of, it's hard to, you're not going to know that until you experience it. Right. And I guess at the time being, you're just going to have to believe me when I tell you that it's unlikely that whatever you choose to be your first job is going to continue to be your first job after 2 years. Right. So knowing that, there's uncertainty there. Right. So coming out guns blazing towards your student loans is probably not the best strategy, no matter what the number is, right? If you may be switching jobs at least once in those first couple of years, right? And again, thankfully, the student loans are set up in a way to really help you navigate that. This is particularly helpful for those of you going into internships, residencies, but can be used strategically by anybody to navigate any kind of, ups and downs in their income and earning potential. So when people do ask, what's the best repayment plan, right? Well, there's a constellation of factors that go into that, right? The two that I think are the most important are reducing the risk to myself and my family, maximizing my monthly cash flow, which means I control the maximum amount of money that I can, right? So I can direct it to other areas other than maybe just my student loans. And then ideally, it would reduce my total repayment costs. Right now, this seems to be the one that most of you care about the most, right? That's the least important one to me. Now, many of you, particularly if you do hit forgiveness, you will get this as well, right? But this is not the first one that I'm shooting for, right? I'm shooting first for keeping those loans at a manageable percentage of my income, particularly during periods of uncertainty, right? So I can still have a financial wellness plan that involves something other than just throwing money at my student loans, right? Because again, as we talked about earlier, you're a little bit late to some of the savings games here. And there are a bazillion other things that you can and should be doing with your money that you're going to be earning as a veterinary professional than putting a good chunk of it towards your student loans, or at least more than your income requires you to. Right? So there's a lot of purpose behind these income-driven plans, particularly in those first few years after graduation, until you actually have kind of a stable footing. You know exactly where your career is, if you found the perfect fit in terms of employment, what your income tends to look like, not just in year 1 and 2, but what it's likely to look like in years 3 to 5, right? So when you have that foundation, then that's when you can, maybe choose a different type of repayment strategy going forward if you're maybe earning more than you ever expected you would earn. Or maybe you'll find that, you've got a couple of bumps in the road here. I'm going to start a family and I'm going to take off a little bit of time, or I've got to, take care of my parents, or I want to buy a home. All of these things that tend to throw a wrench in an aggressive student loan repayment strategy. All right, and this is here again is the disclaimer. 2024 grads, we're going to do a special repayment playbook edition, but a lot of this stuff will apply to you too. Right. So for any veterinary student with federal student loans, as you're graduating or even before you graduate, right, you want to file a tax return. Right. If you're a 4th-year student now and you haven't filed a tax return yet, file one now. Right. It's still tax filing season. Right. So make sure that you have a tax return on file. I'll talk about why that is in just a second. When it gets to that 3rd and 4th year, depending on the school that you're attending, right? Sometimes 3rd year is a little bit more than the first 2 years, or sometimes 4th year is a little bit more than the first 3 years, right? Just be aware of how your school charges tuition, right? And here's a good example. I think I have this somewhere. Let's see if I can find this quickly. If I can't, then I'll come back to it if I have some time later.
Tony, while you look for that, we've got the winners of our Rumple blanket is Ashley Joyce, and the VIN Foundation Yeti is Alex Roberts. So we'll be reaching out to you all with the emails that you registered to get your address for those things. And then we had a couple of questions if you want to take a look at them.
Yeah.
These are from a little bit earlier on, but they've been pretty popular questions. Should we negotiate to increase our salary versus agreeing to a signing bonus?
I think it's always, well, if you can, right? We could talk about that for an hour. There's a weird dynamic going on right now. When you look at the average income of veterinarians who are not new grads, it's almost lower than what new grads are reporting for average salaries, at least in private small animal practice, which is weird. It's kind of an inversion, if you will. And that really has to do with what is being perceived as kind of a shortage, right? They're having a hard time finding bodies to fill positions, and the new grads are kind of that next crop. And if they can secure you, the hope is they're going to train you, get you up to speed, and you're going to stay there, right? But that's probably not sustainable, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense that experienced veterinarians would earn the same or less than new grads. So a lot of that is already kind of baked in to the new grad starting salary. You can try, right? But generally speaking, your salary is some function of what you're going to be able to produce, right? So you have to be a little bit careful there, right? If you negotiate, let's say, too high of a salary and you can't deliver, well, there's going to be some issues, right? You're either going to be adjusted downward, or they may ask you to leave. So yes, it's always worth trying to negotiate as much of a salary as you can possibly get, but you have to kind of also understand what goes into how they're paying you, right? If you can't, or the practice doesn't allow you to generate enough income to justify that salary, then it probably won't be that high for very long. Right? Now, the signing bonus is kind of a one-time deal, right? But it does come with those strings attached. Right, so there's pros and cons to both strategies, right? So you read the offers carefully, visit with those practices, ask around to some of the other veterinarians that are there. Hey, do you have a hard time meeting production goals? How busy is it? What type of services are they generally providing, and are they able to be enough to generate an income to sustain a salary that you might be signing on at? Right. So these are all types of factors that you want to consider when before you sign on to work for a particular employer.
There's a couple of questions about different repayment plans and paying for the expected tax on forgiveness, but I know you'll get to a little bit later, so I don't want to dive too far into that now. Another question that had come up about signing bonuses was, can the signing bonus be paid over 2 calendar years to mitigate the tax impact?
It certainly can, if you can get the employer to agree to that, right? So, I think if you could make a good case to the employer to that, it'd help you on a tax basis to spread that bonus out over 2 different tax years, then great, right? Now, again, make sure you read the conditions carefully, right? I don't know if that would potentially result in extending the length of time that you need to clear before that money is your own, and you don't have to worry about having to pay it back. But that could be one way of making that that tax burden, or the possibility of having to pay it back, a little less burdensome. Cool. So I want to come back to, I was able to find this. So this is our example, and I'm kind of using this to illustrate the cost differences between first year, second year, third year, fourth year, right? So, and this is where we can use then the in-school loan estimator to refine our estimate, right? So I'll come back to that example that we were using, and we know that the person borrowed about 80 something thousand that first year, right? Because they're a non-resident, right? So, and this is how much they could borrow, right? This is what sets the maximum amount that you're able to borrow. But Ohio State is one of these great schools where even a non-resident pays the in-state tuition the next 3 years, right? So the amount that they borrow the next 2 years is significantly lower. But then when we get to fourth year, because you start clinics, right, and you're in school for 12 months instead of 9 months, the tuition is actually significantly higher. Right. Now, this is how OSU works, right? Not every school is set up the same way. Your school might be a little bit different, but generally speaking, I see this type of variation from school to school, right? You can see cost differences from year to year. Usually the third or fourth year is the one that's higher, because it depends on when they start considering it to be 9 months versus 12 months, right? But these are the numbers that you want to focus on in terms of what's going to set the amount that you're able to borrow. But it also sets how much we should be assuming in our in-school loan estimation if we want to have a better, more accurate picture of what our graduation balance is. All right, so I'm going to take these numbers, let's say 57, 57, 83 for the next 3 years. If I come back to my in-school loan estimation, right here, I can see, all the information that we covered so far, we want to make sure that we factor in to this particular in-school loan estimation. This was a good start, right? But now with more information, we can refine our estimates, right? So let's say 57,000, I think it was close to 83 for that fourth year. We also know that those interest rates are going to be higher, right? Let's keep our fingers crossed that maybe they're 7.8, maybe they'll normalize a little bit, start coming back down before this person graduates, right? But that's, again, kind of an optimistic interest rate assumption for those direct unsubsidized loans. So if I make that assumption and redo the estimate, my projection at graduation should be quite a bit less than I was actually assuming before, when I assumed, it was going to be 77,000 per year for the next 3 years. Of course, it's not going to behave for me. Make sure I'm not missing any inputs here. All right. Let's try that again. See if we can get it to work. If not, we'll move on. This is how you can affect those inputs, though, to run those simulations on your own to see if that will be a, give you a little bit better number that you can, put a pin in somewhere and see if you can, beat that number before you hit graduation. I don't know why that's not working, but it figures while we're doing the session, it would not play nicely. So if you have your budget, you filed your tax return, right? Most of you are not going to have very much income to demonstrate on your tax return as a fourth year student, or somewhere between third and fourth year, right? So that can be your income documentation that you use for the SAVE income driven repayment plan, or some other income driven repayment plan that you're choosing to use. For the 24 graduating class, you may have an opportunity to use the pay as you earn plan before it gets phased out this July. But if that looks like it's going to be the best repayment plan for you, you're going to have to act fast, right? The pay as you earn phase out date is July 1st of 2024, right? Most of you graduate April, May, doesn't leave a lot of time to make sure that you get that loan into a plan like pay as you earn before that phase out date. And if that is you, and that's some of the stuff we're going to talk about during the new grad playbook, you have to use a direct consolidation loan. For the rest of you that aren't graduating this year, the consolidation loan is going to become a little bit more optional depending on your circumstances. But for anybody that's graduating in 2024 that wants the opportunity to use pay as you earn, you have to consolidate your loans. It's the only way that you can end your grace period before that July 1st deadline, so you can have a shot at getting your loans into the pay as you earn plan. Anybody that's graduating beyond 2024 is not going to have access to the pay as you earn plan. It will be gone by then, right? So you won't have to worry about it, right? So that's what some of the new, the special edition for the 2024 grad is going to be about, right? There's some real urgent timing that you have to be aware of. And there's a lot of you, it's hard to give you an exact number, but generally anybody that has a debt to income ratio at graduation somewhere between maybe 1.4 and 2.5 might benefit from using pay as you earn more than they would from SAVE in the long run, right? So if that could be you, right, and you want to run student loan repayment simulations to see that, then graduating, consolidating, applying for pay as you earn before that July 1st date is imperative, right? So that's what's going to be really different for the 2024 graduating class. For the rest of you, and for anybody who's going to use SAVE, if you do that same thing, right, whether you consolidate or not, if you get your loans into SAVE using that tax return that you filed during veterinary school, there's a really, really, really good chance that your payment is going to be zero for the first 12 months at least, and the government will cover all of your interest, right? That is the beauty of SAVE, is that it comes with what's called 100% unpaid interest subsidy, which means if whatever your payment is, if it's below the interest that accrues each month, the Department of Education covers that entire interest amount. So now, instead of graduating and trying to pay your loans off as fast as you can, even if you have a really low balance, even if you're graduating with $75,000 of student loans or $100,000 of student loans or something even less than that, you can use SAVE, have a $0 payment. The Department of Education covers the interest. Your loan balance doesn't change. You haven't made any payments, but it gives you that time to get familiar with your new position, your new income, start an emergency fund, start saving for retirement, start saving for the down payment on a home, and your student loan balance will not change, right? Your loans are in a suspended state of animation there, right? No cost difference. So whether you start that aggressive repayment strategy 2 years later versus 1 year earlier, it's going to cost you the same amount. Right. So use that save to your advantage. Right. It is a huge advantage. And this is the one thing I'm looking forward to beyond 2024 is it's going to be super simple. Right. Every new grad veterinarian is going to want to get started with the save repayment plan. Right. And it gives you at least a year, if not more, where you have very little or zero payment towards your student loans, where you can focus on those other aspects of your financial wellness, which are going to pay way bigger dividends in the long run than trying to accelerate that monthly student loan payment. It works exceedingly well for interns and residents, right? So I saw a question earlier, what do we do if I'm doing an internship? You get your loans and save, right? Because if you defer your loans, interest will continue to accrue, just like interest continues to accrue while you're in school now, right? And there's still this reflex in the system to defer your loans while you're doing advanced training like internships and residencies. If you use a plan like Save, you'll have a $0 monthly payment most likely. The Department of Education will cover your interest, and then your payment will gradually increase after you're done with that advanced training, and you'll pay less than you otherwise would have, and you'll be in repayment for a shorter amount of time than you would if you deferred your loans and then tried to pay them aggressively after that. Right, so Save is becoming this very, very useful tool, particularly in those early years after graduation. Internships, residencies, the one thing you have to be a little bit diligent of is the automatic deferment. When you do a residency or a PhD, kind of like you are when you're in school now, the system knows that, and they automatically put your loan into a status that doesn't require you to make payments, right? But that same status can have you accruing interest and not earning forgiveness time, where something like Save would be better, right? So the same issue that we had seen traditionally with academic residencies and PhD programs is going to be the same issue we're trying to combat for those of you that are in the mad scientist category that want to try to get your Grad Plus loans into the Save plan, right? The Department of Education knows you're in school, and they're going to keep wanting to try to automatically defer those loans, right? But if you can waive that deferment and get them into the Save plan, like you can when you're in an academic residency, then you'll have the interest covered, and you'll continue to earn forgiveness eligible time. Right. So that's what the goal that we're looking for. And there's a lot of overlap between what we've counseled people doing academic residencies and PhD in the past to do now for those Grad Plus loan holders during veterinary school, if it works out that way. And these are the side effects that we're going to watch out for too. If your loans do get put in that deferment and there's some unpaid interest, it could get added to the principal in a process called capitalization. That's what ends up increasing your balance and increasing the amount of interest that you accrue going forward.
A couple of good questions have come in recently during that discussion, Tony. Let's see where I want to start here. For those pursuing public service loan forgiveness, should they still make a small monthly payment even if their income-driven repayment plan has a payment set at 0?
No, absolutely not. Whatever your minimum monthly payment is, it can be 0 and it still counts as a payment, right? That's a common, I don't know where that's coming from. That must be somewhere sticky in the social media sphere or somewhere on the internet, but it's not true. Right. And I saw people during the pandemic forbearance that were, working for public service loan forgiveness. So like, well, I continue to make a payment because I wanted my payments to count towards public service loan forgiveness. And that wasn't necessary. Right. So if your minimum monthly payment is 0, then you're still getting credit as long as you're satisfying the employment requirements. You don't have to make a payment above 0 to get credit. You could even so, again, if you file a tax return before you graduate, chances are it's going to be a very low number. That's going to result in a minimum monthly payment that is 0. That $0 payment counts towards forgiveness, whether it's income-driven repayment forgiveness or it's public service loan forgiveness, right? And you get the unpaid interest subsidy if you're using Save, right? So that's the benefit of getting those loans into save after you graduate. And that's one of the triggers too. So you're asking about public service loan forgiveness. So that's why I went to the consolidation. When should you consolidate? If you're starting a public service loan forgiveness eligible job, which would include an academic internship, right? Consolidate your loans, right? Because your grace period is unhelpful, right? It just is. You're not considered to be in repayment during your grace period, even if you make payments. They don't count towards anything, right? They'll still process the payment and subtract off a little bit of interest, but it's not going to count towards forgiveness or count towards public service loan forgiveness unless your loans are actually in a repayment status. Grace period is not repayment. And the only way to end your grace period is by consolidating your loans and choosing to end your grace period early. Right. So anybody that's doing it going directly into a residency like lab animal folks or ClinPlat folks, or if you're doing one of these PhD programs immediately after veterinary school, you have to consolidate your loans after you graduate veterinary school and get them into save. Right. Because if you don't, they can get stuck in an in-school status for the duration of that program. And that's why I've got this PhD one highlighted here, because those are the saddest stories of them all. Right, is the people that have veterinary school student loans, start a PhD program within 3 months after graduating veterinary school, and their PhD lasts 7 years, and they're just racking up interest and they're not getting any kind of credit for it. The only way you can avoid that is by consolidating your loans, ending the grace period, and applying for a repayment plan. Right, once your loans are out of that grace period, then you can waive those in-school deferments. Right. But if you never end the grace period and they get put into an in-school deferment status again, you're stuck in that status until you finish that program. And that's particularly problematic for PhD folks because they're so long. Right. So as soon as, and if there's any question, it's never wrong to consolidate your loans, but it's going to become more optional. And there's going to be a bigger cost benefit analysis that we're all going to have to do as the 2027 class approaches and you have a higher unpaid interest balance, right? Because now, as you can see, the note here says consolidation capitalizes your interest, not consolidating doesn't, right? So we'll have to factor that in at some point. Right now, most people who are graduating now or next year have very little unpaid interest relatively. So consolidating it is really not a big deal. And if you end up reaching public service loan forgiveness, it's not going to matter anyway. Right. So there's all of these factors that we have to kind of take into account. What are you doing? When are you starting? How much unpaid interest balance do you have? Do you have any of these health profession student loans? If you do, you have to consolidate your loans anyway, because that's the only way to get them to be eligible for forgiveness. Right. Now, don't shoot the messenger here. I didn't design this system. This is why this is so annoying. Right. They're super flexible, but super annoying. And most of the pitfalls happen right after you graduate and you get into repayment, right? And for most of you, there's a ton of stuff going on after graduation and you're like, oh my God, why would I ever want to think about my student loans? And it's because if you don't, there could be some really long-term side effects, right? So this is where it's so, important. And I'm glad everybody took the time out tonight to join us, but, knowing what to do with your student loans and making good on that plan within that first few months after you graduate is really, really important. Right. So if you can, put it on a calendar or, tattoo it to your arm or whatever you need to do, how you get into repayment is probably one of the most important aspects of student loan repayment. And one of the reasons why we spend so much time on it. All right. Actually, I'm going to do, let's see. I'm going to show you some mistakes, right? So during school, the biggest mistakes that I see people making, right, and I saw it again in some of the comments that you guys submitted in your Signament forms, is trying to avoid student loans, right? Again, I get it. There's probably a lot of stuff on the interwebs out there that say how bad student loans are, and they can be. They're super annoying, right? But they're really beneficial too, really flexible. So if you can have access to them and you're not taking full advantage of that and you're instead using some other type of debt instead of those student loans, you're not helping yourself, right? So make sure you exhaust those first. Now, if you've hit the limit of federal student loans and you're still coming up short, well, then we've got to do some, let's say, extreme budget makeover, right? So you should be able to get through veterinary school with the amounts that they offer you in federal student loans, right? If not, reach out for some help and we'll see if we can help you tweak that budget to make that so. Paying your federal student loans while you're in school and still borrowing, not a good idea, right? We talked about that earlier. You're not going to gain any ground by using student loan funds to pay interest, right? Borrow less and you'll actually have a lower principal, you'll accrue lower amounts of interest, and you'll pay less in total. Not filing a tax return before you graduate, right? A lot of people don't want to, you never had to before. It sounds intimidating. It's super easy, particularly if you don't have any money. Right? If you don't have any income to show, it's really easy to file a tax return, right? So, and you can voluntarily file one. You don't have to, meet any kind of requirements. And even if your parents are still claiming you as a dependent, you can still file your own tax return. Now, for those of you that are married before you graduate, it might make sense for you to file that last tax return before you graduate separate from your spouse. So you exclude your spouse's income from that save monthly payment calculation. Using signing bonuses to pay your student loans or anything else, right? Those are great, but you're going to have to hold on to them for a little while until you use them, right? Just until you clear those conditional time hurdles, so you're not forced to pay back money that you don't have, right? That's going to set you back. Consolidation procrastination. Again, I know, graduation is a celebratory time and moving is super hectic, but if you forget to do this stuff before you start your first job or your internship, you're probably going to forget about it completely, right? So use that time before you start your first gig as a veterinarian to consider, do I need to consolidate? Have I consolidated? Have I submitted that application? Is it headed in the right direction? Don't choose the income-based repayment plan, right? And this is another one of those common, unfortunately, because the system is super confusing, right? You have a variety of options available to you. And a lot of times people just call them all income-based repayment, and that's not correct. Right? Income-based repayment is actually a version of what is known as the income-driven plans. I see this happen all of the time. Oh, I thought I heard somebody say I should just choose income-based repayment, so I checked that box on the application. They will put you in income-based repayment, right? That specific plan, and that's not the plan you want to be in, right? And unfortunately, again, weird quirk of the system, when you switch out of income-based repayment, they capitalize your unpaid interest, right? So not only do you maybe make an oops on the repayment plan choice, but you get penalized for getting out of it too, right? So some of you, and this is way down the line that we're not going to talk about tonight, for some of you, it may make sense to end up in income-based repayment, but nobody should be starting with income-based repayment, right? You want to start with either save, or for some of you 2024 grads, pay as you earn if you're eligible for it, right? Those are the only two choices you should be looking at when it comes to an income-driven plan. Missing renewals, right? So this is part of the arrangement, part of the what it means to be a 21st century student loan carrier. You have to be an active participant. Right? There is no set it and forget it anymore, right? If you're using an income-driven plan, you have to provide updated income information at least annually, right? If you miss that, there are consequences, right? A lot of people, when they take time off, they switch jobs, they go on, paternity or maternity leave, they request a forbearance or deferment. Don't do that, right? If your income decreases, you can have your payment adjusted downward to reflect that lower income, all the way down to zero, right? And if you're using save, you get that unpaid interest subsidy where they cover your unpaid interest for you while those payments are below your monthly interest accrual. Paying more than your income requires, especially while you're using save, right? And this kind of gets into the details, and we may not have enough time tonight to get into those, but the way that the unpaid interest subsidy works, I'm seeing a lot of kind of confusion around this too. People think, okay, well, the Department of Education is covering all my interest. If I make an extra payment, it's going to go directly to the principal. Fortunately, it doesn't work that way. Right. So the unpaid interest subsidy is net of your payments. Right. So if your monthly interest is $1,000 and your payment is $0, right? If you make a payment of $500 thinking it's going to go to the principal, it instead just reduces the $1,000 subsidy that you were going to receive to $500. Right, so it doesn't make financial sense to pay extra while you're receiving the save unpaid interest subsidy. Right, and this has special implications for those of you that choose to work for an employer who will make payments towards your student loans. Right. So I just told you that it doesn't make sense to make additional payments when you're not covering the interest and using save. And I also told you that you can have a $0 payment for the first 12 months at least using save. If your employer is making payments during that time, it's 100% wasted. Right. So this is where some of these attempts to help with your student loans don't necessarily play nicely with the system. Right, so just consider that when you're courting offers, and if you see that a lot of employers think, oh, well, I'll offer an employer payment towards your student loans, and that'll help me recruit new veterinarians. Well, it might, right, but it might not help you or your student loans at all, right? So, and as part of your compensation, that's kind of just going down the drain, right? So you could try to negotiate maybe more beneficial aspects in your compensation plan if that is something that might work for you, but I haven't found the employers to be terribly receptive to that just yet. And then probably the biggest one is putting other areas of your financial wellness on the back burner while you pay your student loans first, and that's just really something that you just can't afford to do. And there's so many other better things that you can do with your money that'll have higher returns. So hopefully you'll take advantage of those. Another question for you guys, if you want to put some answers or thoughts in the chat, what happens if you don't pay your student loans fast enough? Because that's, again, one of those other concerns I see expressed a lot, particularly from students, is like, I have to do this, I have to do this. It feels like a sprint that I have to get to the end and see this zero balance on my student loans, or else what? What happens if you don't pay your student loans fast enough? Forgiveness, maybe. Yeah, that's actually definitely an outcome, potentially. Yeah, great. Thank you, Zachary. So I wanted to touch on this too. So student loans should not impact your financial freedom, and that's a loaded term. What does that mean? I share with you guys. I mean, between my wife and I, we have more than $400,000 of student debt. It has never affected anything that we've tried to do personally or professionally, other than occasionally I have to spend too much time on hold with my loan servicer. Right. So I get that sentiment, but I struggle to see where it actually impacts your financial freedom. And if you're smart about how you allocate the income that you're using, you'll watch your student loan balance, no matter what it is. You'll watch your student loan balance become a smaller and smaller and smaller part of your overall wealth and net worth, and any kind of objective measure you can make financially. So, and if you think about it, if I have something either horrible that happens to me, or I lose my job and I don't earn any income, my student loan payment goes down, right? So it's hard for me to see where exactly it impacts my quote financial freedom. So I mean, if you want to expand upon that and maybe tell me what I'm missing there, I've heard that a million times, and I'm just trying to understand it a little bit more. And when I think about that in the context of student loans, I'm like, Your student loans allow you to reach financial freedom sooner rather than later because you have this ability to pay it based on your income. If you earn a lot of money, you'll pay your student loans back faster. If you don't earn a lot of money, you won't pay your student loans back faster, but you still have forgiveness as an option just in case. Right? Either way, your loans are gone. Right? There's no other debt that you will ever have that will work like that. So I think I'm going to have to work on, that financial freedom definition a little bit and how that works into the context of student loans. But yeah, I mean, what happens if you don't pay your student loans fast enough? Nothing. Right? You'll either earn enough to pay the balance to zero before you reach forgiveness, or you'll reach forgiveness. Right? And hopefully, if you know you're going to reach forgiveness, you're going to be planned for the potential tax that could be associated with it. Right? So either way, you're kind of done with your student loans. Yeah, that's the next kind of question that usually comes out of the financial freedom discussion from Cole. Do these loans impact our credit score and ability to take out a mortgage? They don't. If anything, they can actually help you in that regard. Right? Now, the only exception to that is when your payment is zero. Right? If you have a student loan balance and the minimum monthly payment that shows up on your credit report is zero, which again, I told you it can be for at least the first 12 months after graduation, that can complicate getting additional financing. Right? But instead of seeking that financing while your payment is zero, you can instead benefit from that $0 payment and work towards building the down payment on something like a home for the over that period where your payment is zero. And then eventually when that payment is greater than zero, then they'll take that. Right? When you go to obtain that financing, they'll look at that, they'll see that minimum monthly payment, and they'll factor that into the overall equation on your credit worthiness and riskiness evaluation. Right? And using an income-driven plan will actually make you look like a much better borrowing candidate than if you're using a time-driven plan that has a much higher monthly payment, a much higher percentage of your overall take-home pay. Right? So it can actually help you obtain a mortgage for a home or a practice or investment property or whatever. Right? So don't think just because you have student loans on your ledger means that no bank is going to touch you. I mean, my wife and I, again, we have $400,000 of student loans. We've sought financing for a number of different opportunities. Not once have I ever had a bank ask me a second question about my student loans, other than pulling the credit report and seeing what the minimum monthly payment is on there. So it just doesn't play out that way. All right, I see a question here from Danielle about how do you calculate the tax you'd need to pay after the 25 years of forgiveness, and that's going to take me over to the simulator. Let's see if the in-school loan estimator is playing nicely here. It finally ran. All right, great. It finally ran. I don't know why it was taking a little bit extra time, but let's kind of keep using our case that we were using earlier. Our Ohio State student. Now we've made our updates to the tuition and the interest rates, and we've got our total balance at graduation. I'm going to send this over to the loan repayment simulator. Right, so it pulls over the principal, the amount of interest that we assumed, the average interest rate. We'll assume in this case that we're not going to consolidate our loans. Right, if you were going to consolidate your loans, you would choose this other deferment consolidation because then it'll take that unpaid interest and capitalize it. Right, but for this time being, we'll leave that off. We'll assume some starting level of income. And then we'll also increase that income by some amount. We kind of kick you off with 3.5%, but you can change that to anything that you would like. For new grads, I would highly recommend that you read this text and hit this reduce first and second year's income button, right? Because if you file a tax return before you graduate, it's most likely going to show something zero, something low, zero, or something close to it. Right, that's going to be what you use to apply for that income-driven plan. If I start my job at $130,000 per year, and I'm starting it in June or July, I'm already halfway through that tax year, right? So that next tax return I file is going to show about half of this income, right? So that's why I want to adjust these incomes here, because that's logistically the opportunity you're going to have to apply your income to an income-driven plan. If you're married, you can use the no, yes, ever popular, not yet, right? When you're going to get married will matter. When you start to have kids will matter. If your spouse has student debt, that will matter. Right? All of those things are factored into these equations, particularly when you're using an income-driven plan. When it comes to assessing the tax, right, that's in the advanced simulator settings, right? The initial setting that we have, 30% tax rate on forgiveness, right? That's to get you started. Right now, that's probably an overestimate, right? Unless we have some major change to how we tax people in this country, that tax is likely going to be somewhere in the mid to high 20s, right? But depending on the state you live in, you can maybe have state tax be added to that. If you live in a higher tax state like Illinois, New Jersey, California, right, that can impact the amount of tax that you pay. But you'll start to see this when you get out and start filing tax returns. Right, what your effective tax rate is, or your average tax rate plus your marginal tax rate. Right, it's not at a set level. Right, it depends on what your income is, what the tax rates are at the time, and all of the different deductions and things that go into your complicated tax return. Right, and right now there's actually a tax exemption on forgiveness. Right, anybody that receives student loan forgiveness between tax years 2021 and 2025. Don't have to pay tax at all on any amount of student loans that's forgiven at the federal level, right? And we may see that extended. It really depends on how the elections pan out, right? So you've got one administration that's wanting to extend or make permanent this tax exemption on student loan forgiveness, and another one that wants to kind of blow up all of the changes that have happened in the last 2 or 3 years, right? So voting matters too. Right, all of this stuff impacts you, right? So you kind of have to do a little bit of homework and see which might benefit you most and which aligns with your politics, right? But that number, I mean, it's not like I can give you a magic number, right? It's going to depend, right? But 30% would get you in a decent ballpark, right? And then you have to choose, how am I going to save for it? Right, as I showed you before, I mean, even if you just do a high yield savings account, you can probably get more than 4%, right? So, we could be a little bit aggressive there. I'm earning something closer to 10%, but again, you have to be a little bit more comfortable with investing. If you are, great. If not, you can also look for folks to help you with that sort of activity as well. The poverty growth rate has to do with how they adjust the calculation to factor your payment. This generally tracks inflation. So right now, this is probably an underestimate because we're kind of in a high inflationary environment, but over the long haul, it tends to fall somewhere between 2 and 3%, right? So I probably wouldn't be terrible to adjust this up a little bit at this point because that inflation has been lingering a little bit longer than anybody has been anticipating, right? But that number is really not terribly, you don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about that number. We run this simulation and we start comparing, right? And this is what I look for, right? If I tried to pay it back fast, right, it'd be $3,300 a month, right? Versus the zero I can pay if I file my tax return before I graduate. In the next 2 years, if I use a standard 10-year plan, I'm paying $80,000 towards our student loans versus $2,700 if I use SAVE. Over the next 5 years, right, $201,000 versus $34,000, right? Those are significant differences, right? There's a $165,000 difference available to you over a 5-year period that you can use to buy a home, start your retirement savings, start a family, maybe have an opportunity fund to buy into a practice or start your own practice, right? That's where that money can come from. And it really is just as simple as knowing your repayment options, right? Yeah, you can certainly choose to do this, but that means you're postponing all of those other things, right? Because you're going to have to come up with that $165,000 somewhere else, right? And, it's just, to me, this is the low-hanging fruit. So I keep working my way down. Does it look like I'm going to hit forgiveness? It does. Right? What's that tax look like? Maybe 96,000. In this particular case, even using save through the 25 years, I would pay less than if I tried to pay the balance back faster. Right? And this is the counterintuitive part of student loan repayment, where, you know, even if you are in repayment longer and pay based on your income, it could end up saving you money compared to trying to pay it off more aggressively. Forgiveness planning fund, if I'm trying to figure out how am I going to set a target, here's my target. 96,000, 25 years from now, I have to set aside $163 if I can earn 5% return per year on that. And in 25 years, I will have enough on hand. It will cost me $48,900 to hit that $96,000 target. I've now reduced my total repayment cost by a significant amount. That was the difference I showed you earlier between the dotted line, what I contribute to my forgiveness fund, and the solid line, the value of that fund, right? That's what materializes as the savings, right? Here. So 40-something thousand dollars of savings between those two numbers based on how I'm using this to plan for my potential tax down the road. Right, so that's how it works. That's what it looks like in repayment, right? So, and that's how you can use those to then make a decision on which repayment plan should I use. Now, in this particular instance, we know too, this is kind of a little bonus advanced student loan repayment, right? I know this person's eligible for the new version of IBR, and this is something we'll be talking about more and more in the new grad playbooks. This is something that popped up last year when they created SAVE, right? So for anybody that's eligible for the new version of IBR, they can, let me find the simulation. I think it's this one. They can use SAVE for 5 years maximum and still have the option to switch to the new version of IBR, which is very similar to Pay, which is being phased out. You can see that there's a lower total cost profile here. Right, so I can get the best of both worlds, navigating that uncertain environment in the first 5 years after I graduate by using SAVE, switching to the new version of IBR so I hit forgiveness sooner. The new version of IBR has a shorter forgiveness time frame than SAVE does. I will pay a little bit more in taxes because I hit forgiveness sooner, right? So I have to bump up my forgiveness savings plan. But overall, now I just saved another, you know, $40,000, $50,000 on my student loan repayment strategy, right? So these are some pretty big numbers, right? I mean, there's when I continue to do this, I don't see a lot of compelling evidence for aggressively trying to pay your student loans back. You're certainly welcome to do it. There's nothing wrong with it, right? But you're leaving money on the table. So it's just, you know, it's up to you in terms of how you choose to do this. And if you would like some guidance, that's where we're here to help, right? That's where Rebecca and I are here to help you through this process using that student debt message board area, so you can understand all of those differences in repayment that come up along the way, right? And you guys will always have access to this area, right? So all veterinary students have free access to VIN. Even if you don't continue your VIN membership beyond, you still have access to your student debt message board discussion and the other discussions that are on the VIN Foundation version of this message board. So you guys can always get assistance with your student loans. And the way that we do this, you'll see a lot of this mimics this signalment form that you completed. We post this over here anonymously under your account, and then we do a thorough analysis of your student loans, kind of give you a written treatment plan to pursue. And then as things change, you come back in here and post and keep following up. And we can counsel you for as long as you need that assistance. So yes, it's complicated. It can feel like torture sometimes, but again, the numbers are well worth it financially in terms of helping you to build a more comprehensive financial profile sooner rather than later. All right, that's a lot, and I know we're kind of over time here, so I'm going to cut it. I'm going to cut it there. Again, there's a lot more stuff on here that you guys can click through. I can see, let me kind of work through some of these questions, I think. Sarah asked, how long do you have to pay off the taxes on forgiven amount? Do you have to save it up yourself and pay it all at once? Ideally, you would do that, yes. Right, and that's a question that always comes up, and I think that's just kind of a you'll get more familiar with taxes as you earn income and file tax returns. Taxes are not as scary as you think, right? As long as you pay attention to them and as long as you find a good tax professional that can help you navigate those sorts of things. But yes, I mean, that's what you want to do, right? If ideally you would want to take care of that tax that you owe in the year that you owe it, right? You don't want to extend that out any longer, because then you're going to pay interest on the taxes that you owe and fees associated with not paying your taxes on time, right? So you can extend that, but you don't want to do that, right? So and there are some, emergency measures for people who hit forgiveness and don't have enough assets to cover the tax and things like that. But that really shouldn't apply to anybody here, right? Unless you have some really, really unfortunate circumstances, right? And maybe that'll happen, but it shouldn't be the case right now as you're sitting here as a veterinary student about to start your career as a veterinarian, right? So if you are responsible enough to use a plan like this and start your forgiveness savings plan early, you'll be fine in terms of covering the tax, right? Even though it might be a really big number. Oh, anonymous attendee asks, what happens if your parent passes who was responsible for the bill with the Parent Plus loan? That loan goes away. Whether the parent passes or you pass, the loan goes away, right? So it's kind of another one of those baked in benefits for federal student loans. Can you refinance private loans, and would you recommend that? Two things there. I would not recommend refinancing a federal student loan with a private loan, right? So there is no private loan that's going to give you the benefits that your federal student loans have. You may someday find a private loan that has a better interest rate, but your student loans go way beyond just interest rates. So I would never repay a federal student loan with a private loan. But if you have a less beneficial private loan, then absolutely, if you can refinance that private loan into a better private loan, that would be ideal, right? But unfortunately, that requires you to have a really good credit score and history, which is generally not the case for most students, right? So you may have to wait a little while before you can find a better deal on potentially a less beneficial private student loan after you're kind of out a little while and have had a chance to build your credit. All right. Okay, so Zachary asks, so I have a unique circumstance of having a low interest private loan and the super high interest federal loan. I wanted to be aggressive with payback towards the high interest, but I'm starting to think it makes more sense to tackle the private loan first and utilize the flexibility of the federal student loans. You took the words right out of my mouth. That is an outstanding idea. That's exactly what I would recommend you do. So get your payments to be zero using the save plan for the first year. It'll be very low the second year. And you can use that to aggressively pay off those private student loans. And then you can, reevaluate whether or not it makes sense to continue paying your federal student loans based on your income, or if it makes sense to pay some amount that will pay that balance to zero faster. Are you concerned about converting short-term debt to long-term debt? That's a pretty vague one. I'm not worried about converting any other debt to federal student loan debt, right? Because again, the short-term and long-term have kind of different meanings in the federal student loan world, right? And because I can pay those balances based on my income, and if I do end up hitting forgiveness, I may pay a lower interest rate than I would if I had left it as a short-term balance, right? So that one would probably need a little bit more specifics to tie to it to answer it in a little bit more detail. Oh, let's see. If it's within 120 days from the enrollment of a loan, but then return it, are you allowed to take it back out again? I believe you would be able to, as long as you're still within that semester time frame. You can always borrow more up to the cost of attendance that's covering that academic period. So I believe you should be able to do that. I mean, it would be kind of a weird way to go about it, but you should be able to do that. The second part of that question from Anonymous, that's one I would encourage you to put on the message boards. Would really have to work through that one in a little more detail. I think I know the loan type that you're talking about, but I would want to confirm that. So well, I would post that one on the message boards and let's see if we can dive a little deeper there. Alex, let's see some of these. So sorry if this was already covered, but how do we even go about, oh, I don't know where that question went. There it is. How do we even go about making sure putting our loans into the SAVE plan? So you would use studentaid.gov, right? So you can apply for a repayment plan at studentaid.gov, and you could do it all electronically. And that's where you'll pull that tax return information into that application. And is it 100% of us that graduate after 2024 that will for sure want to go to SAVE? Yeah, as of from what I can tell right now, we could see some changes between now and when you graduate in 2026. I hope not. There's been too many changes to keep up with recently, but presuming there are no changes, then SAVE is going to be the best plan for you to get started in, for sure. Does switching from one repayment plan to another reset the months? It does not. Another common misconception. Thanks for asking that. But yes, no, it does not reset your forgiveness time. Your forgiveness time transfers from one repayment plan to another. Katie asks, I go to a very expensive private school and my cost of living is also very high. My graduation balance is pretty high and I accepted that. As a 2024 grad, is pay-as-you-earn better since it is for 20 years, or is SAVE better? Yeah, so this is what I call the new grad pickle, right? And that's, again, what we're going to talk about during that special edition of the new grad playbook. It sounds to me, now I think I mentioned it earlier, it depends on what your debt to income ratio is there, right? You can use that as a guideline. But if it's more than, maybe 2.5, then you're probably going to want to stay with SAVE, right? You'll lose access to pay-as-you-earn, but SAVE might be better for you anyway. That's where the loan repayment simulator is actually going to kind of give you that guidance. Right? So I would plug your best guess of your future earnings into the loan repayment simulator and see if it's an obvious choice. I suspect that SAVE is going to look pretty beneficial for you. The higher your student loan balance gets, the better SAVE gets. Right, so the new grad pickle, those of you that could benefit from pay-as-you-earn, you tend to fall more in the 170 to 250-ish student debt range. So just as kind of some ballparks, but I would really run those to the simulator to better answer that question. And please join the new grad student loan repayment playbook because we're going to focus on that a lot. Okay, wow, let's see here. As a second-year student living at home without living expenses, but utilizing loans for everything else, how much should I realistically have in my savings account? Well, that's up to you, right? I mean, it depends on what you're living expense amounts are. I mean, I would still recommend you have some kind of emergency fund, and that's going to tie back to your budget. You know, what are your average living expenses? You may live at home, but I'm sure you still have some average major living expenses. So you may want to have an emergency fund on hand to cover maybe some unexpected expenses, but that's really going to be answered by your budget.
I always like to encourage students to look at like what are the potential emergencies you could have, right? Do you have a car? Could it break down? Do you have a pet? Do you have a vet student type pet that is a lemon?
Yes.
Maya's currently snoring in my lap right now. So I definitely understand how those things can come up with some additional expenses.
Exactly. If you have the three-legged, one-eyed animal named Lucky, then you probably need more than $1,000 emergency fund for sure. So even with your vet student discount, right, you're probably going to need a little bit more robust emergency fund or have some pet insurance. So, you know, one of those two will probably help to reduce a risk like that. Can parents claim me as a dependent and put my 1098-T form on their tax return? If they're paying your tuition, they can. So, but if you're paying the tuition and you're paying the tuition with student loans, then no, right? They can still claim you as a dependent. Those are questions for a tax professional too, right? So, you know, I'm sure your parents have an accountant or somebody. That would be something that I would steer towards them. Do you have to consolidate your PLUS loans if you are in school and wanting to put the loans into an income-driven plan like SAVE? I don't believe you'll have to, right? So direct loans by themselves are eligible for SAVE. And the direct PLUS loans, because they're not technically in an in-school status, you should be able to just apply for them without consolidating. Yeah, so I don't think you'll have to consolidate. Although, you know, I don't even want to open that can of worms. So, but there's a few of those on the message boards. But that is another one of those unique ones. If there's any 2024 grads still lingering here, if you do a student loan physical exam and you have loans from before veterinary school that have some repayment time. Now, this kind of falls into that new grad pickle, but it's even beyond that. We have found recently some new grads that maybe they were career changers, whatever the case was, that have, you know, 7 years of repayment time on their student loans from before veterinary school. Right now, there is what's called a one-time forgiveness count adjustment. And if you can consolidate those loans, which again, if you have PLUS loans or loans that were previously in repayment, you can still consolidate them while you're in school, but it won't include all of your loans in that consolidation. You'll get some bonus forgiveness time, right? But you have to do that before April 30th, right? So like 40 days from now, in order for you to get that maximum forgiveness count adjustment. And really the only pathway I see this working out is for fourth year students, right? Because you can consolidate your loans before the April 30th deadline, and you're graduating in the next month, 2 months, 3 months most. You'll have an opportunity to add those loans that you can't consolidate into that new consolidation loan and potentially get that additional forgiveness time, right? This is like Mad Max level of mad scientist, right? So we've got a few of those cooking on the message boards now, but if you're one of those fourth year students who was maybe a career changer or have some older loans that had some repayment time, then please reach out, post on the message boards, because we might be able to sneak your way into some bonus forgiveness time, which will shorten your repayment and and lessen your total repayment costs. Can we go ahead and apply for the SAVE plan if we know that's what we're going to do and we're about to graduate? Yeah, again, you can apply for SAVE now, but it's only going to apply for those loans that are not direct unsubsidized loans that are stuck in that in-school status, right? So if you apply now, you might have to apply again, right? So unless you're doing it to satisfy one of those special kind of mad scientist cases that we've been talking about, I would hold off until you officially graduate. Yeah, so Justin, I see you're reaching out there. So I would either email us at studentdebt at vinfoundation.org or post on the message boards, right? So using the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center link, while you're logged in, you'll see a link to the message boards. You can post on the message boards, and then we'll walk through kind of that analysis of your loans and see if we can talk you through that. Can you only get into the SAVE program if you have taxes filed this year? It's the easiest way to get in, right? If you don't have a tax return, then you have to provide some other kind of income information, right? So whatever else you have besides a tax return would work, right? But the system is really set up to most efficiently use the tax return, a recently filed tax return. And again, if you haven't filed one for this year, then file one now. You can still file one now. I mean, you've got time. Yeah, again, even if your parents claimed you as a dependent and you didn't have a job, you can still voluntarily file your own tax return, right? So it won't affect any of that, right? We're just looking for some document in the IRS universe that has your name and social security number on it and an adjusted gross income number. None of those things are going to be affected by whether or not your parents claim you as a dependent. So you can still voluntarily file a tax return. Does it matter if your internship or residency is in private practice or academia? This is in relation to the benefits of the SAVE plan. No, absolutely not. So SAVE is a function of your student loans. If your internship is in academia, then you can also earn public service loan forgiveness, but you won't be able to earn public service loan forgiveness progress in a private practice internship. Should I consolidate? I am hoping to do public service loan forgiveness. If that means yes. So I would consolidate if you're hoping to do public service loan forgiveness and all of your loans are not direct loans. Is it better for a graduating lab animal track student to consolidate loans if they are not doing a residency right away, but instead jumping into industry? Who, again, when are you graduating? I don't, if it's this year, then I would still lean towards consolidating. But if it's not, then maybe there's a case for you not to consolidate. So that one's going to depend on when you graduate. When would be the best time to consolidate health profession student loans? After you graduate, right? Now you have to wait for those health profession student loans to enter their grace period, right? They're kind of like the direct unsubsidized loans. They are a little bit annoying, and sometimes they take a little bit longer to officially enter their grace period. So you might have to wait, 30, 60 days after you graduate in order to include them in a consolidation. Now, if you're bumping up against if you're a new grad 2024 that wants to try to use pay as you earn, then don't worry about the health profession student loan. Consolidate the ones that you can consolidate and then maybe add that one later. And the employer payment is taxable to you for employers that make payments towards your student loans. Actually, it depends, not always. So there's a special benefit in the CARES Act that lasts through 2025 and will probably be extended as well, where up to $5,250 of student loan payments paid by an employer to your student loans can be treated as tax-free if they set up the plan right. Right now, it's we've seen a lot of different permutations of that so far on the message boards. It's funny, you have to set it up kind of like
interesting ones, and they are getting more and more curious all the time.
You have to set it up kind of like a 401k, which means every employee has to be eligible for it in order for it to be tax deductible. And it's mostly geared towards larger organizations. And some of them have actually foregone the tax deductible student loan payment because then they can actually choose to offer it to some employees and not others, right? In those cases, then it would be taxable to you. But then again, the question for you is it beneficial, right? Just because they offer it doesn't mean it's beneficial, right? And if you're using SAVE and you're receiving the unpaid interest subsidy, there's a good chance that that employer payment, whether it's tax-free or taxable, is not going to be beneficial to you. But it will be particularly not beneficial to you if you also have to pay taxes on it. So that's again, that's probably a session for another time, but an excellent question. If we were using SAVE and taking advantage of the $0 payments for the first year, do you recommend we tackle private loans during that time just because of their higher interest rate, 15% in my case? Absolutely. Absolutely. So that, again, and we didn't get to the financial wellness topic here, but that's, graduate, get your loans into SAVE, get that $0 payment if you can for as long as you can, and use that time to pay back less flexible debt while building other areas of your financial wellness. That's exactly what you should do. If I could make good income off stock investments, how would that affect me if I'm on the SAVE program? Would I be disqualified? You could never be disqualified from SAVE. Your payment will always be a percentage of your income. If your income includes gains or dividends from stocks and investments, then your student loan payment will be higher, right? So, but what a great problem to have, right? So you at that point, depending on how much income you've earned from those types of investments and how consistent it is, you may want to choose to use a plan that's not based on your income, but again, let's cross that bridge when we come to it, kind of thing. Glenn is asking, can I review the debt to income ratio pertaining to student loans? Okay, I can do that. I kind of skipped over that, but here, generally speaking, like again, ballparks, and these are kind of shifting because again, SAVE is way more beneficial than when these guidelines, we kind of initially conceived of them. But generally speaking, if you graduate from veterinary school with a student debt to income ratio that's less than 1, meaning that your income is greater than your student debt balance, you're probably not going to reach forgiveness, even if you're working towards public service loan forgiveness. You might if you're close to 1, but if you're less than 1, your income is probably going to be such that it will pay the balance to 0 before you hit forgiveness, maybe even public service loan forgiveness. You can still use SAVE in the early years strategically to have that $0 payment and let the government cover the interest while the payments are really low, right? But you're going to pay the balance to 0 before you hit forgiveness. You won't have to worry about forgiveness. But that's a great position to be in. You could use these things strategically. If your starting student debt to income ratio is greater than 2, and probably actually closer to about 1.5, you're likely going to reach forgiveness unless you have a major increase to your income within maybe the first 5 years after you graduate, right? And that does happen, right? Especially with emergency practitioners, right? But then the question is, are you likely to remain in emergency medicine? That has an even higher turnover than small animal general practice. So, sometimes, again, it really depends on the circumstances whether or not you're going to reach forgiveness. And that's why we rerun the numbers generally every year when you have a better idea of what your income's doing. But, if you're starting with a greater than 2 to 1 debt to income ratio, quite likely that you're going to reach forgiveness. So pick the plan that's the best. In this case, SAVE. If you're a 2024 grad, maybe that's pay the minimum, plan for forgiveness. Yeah, this question always comes up. How does earning a high salary of greater than $250,000 impact the SAVE plan? Same answer as the stock investment. If I'm doing really well with stock investments, if I make a higher income, I pay a higher share of my income, right? The payments are a percentage of your income, right? So if you're earning $250,000 a year, your payment will be higher, right? Roughly 10% or so of that, a little bit less, right? So great problem to have, right? It may help to accelerate your payoff, which again is why I love the SAVE plan, right? As you earn more, you'll pay more towards your student loans, but it's the same percentage of your income. So it shouldn't disturb your budget, right? When you get to a point where you're earning $250,000 a year, 10% of that going towards your student loans shouldn't matter, but it will accelerate your payoff of your student loans. And maybe you'll even hit zero before you hit forgiveness. But what a great way to pay back your student loans, letting your income determine how much that payment should be. Right? It'll depend whether or not you hit forgiveness will depend on when your income hits that 250 or greater level. Is seeing the status of our student loans to make sure we are not in automatic deferment as simple as accessing our student aid account? Yes, absolutely. And I would grab the file and upload it into the My Student Loans tool. And some of the things that we'll be looking for is whether or not you're still earning interest, right? If your repayment plan says repay or save here and your unpaid interest isn't growing, then we know you're doing the right thing. Right? But if it says in school or standard 10 and you still see that unpaid interest balance growing, then we know you probably need to apply for save again to try to get that loan into that save plan. So yeah, that's exactly what that would look like. And that's kind of what we're looking for here to counsel you through that, so we can establish maybe some best practices on how to do this, at least while this what seems to be a loophole persists in the system. Right? You used to not be able to get your loans into repayment while you're in school. And for some reason now it seems to be a lot easier, at least for these Grad Plus loans. So I don't know how long that will last, but if you could take advantage of it for any length of time with the Grad Plus loan rates at this level, then I would go for it. How do employee student loan payment programs work? Corporate will pay $1,000 a month directly towards our student loans. Yeah, so
Came
that's
in when we were talking about save.
okay. So yeah, and this is where, well, first of all, if they're going to pay $1,000 a month towards your student loans, then some of that's going to be taxable to you, right? Again, the limit is $5,250 per year, which means that you would exceed that limit, which means anything above that $5,250, even if they had it set up as a tax-free contribution, would be taxable to you. Right now, what happens is usually they make a payment towards your student loan servicer, right? Whether you owe $1,000 a month or not on your student loans, they'll take that $1,000 a month. And that $1,000 a month will generally get applied proportionally across all of your remaining student loan balances. Interest first, after all of the interest is paid off, then it can hit the principal, right? But if your minimum monthly payment is below your employer payment and you're using a plan like Save or you're accruing more than $1,000 a month of interest in that example, that's all going to go wasted towards your student loans, right? So it depends. Right? If you have a very low student loan balance, you could probably benefit from $1,000 per month payment from your employer. If you have an average amount of student debt, $200,000 or more, right, then it's probably not going to be very beneficial. So it really depends on your specific circumstances and how much they're paying towards those student loans. Laura, you've got all these great tax questions. Unfortunately, I am not a tax expert. That would be a question for a tax professional there. The 1098-T just documents how much you paid towards tuition. Whether or not you're able to receive education tax credits are going to depend on a whole bunch of things that I'm not very familiar with. So you can see if that would be the case for you, but I would recommend reaching out to a tax professional for those sorts of things. If I have about $150,000 in student loans and plan on working in private practice straight out of graduation, I'm an avid investor in the stock market, would you recommend utilizing the 10% return average of the stock market by paying the minimum monthly payment through Save and investing about 20 to 25% of your income? Well, parts of that I would say are perfectly fine, right? Absolutely. If you want to use Save and have your payment pegged to your income to have more money to invest, hopefully, ideally, you're going to look at some tax advantage ways of doing that first, like in a retirement savings account, a Roth IRA, or a 401k, or something that your employer might provide. Then absolutely, right? How much of your income you should invest is totally up to you, right? That's going to depend upon your budget, but you're on the right track, right? This is exactly, so rather than starting with the student loan payment first, when we talk about budgeting, I'm going to build the budget that has me contributing 10 or 15% of my gross income into some kind of retirement savings, ideally tax advantaged. I'm going to have other items in my budget accounted for. If I'm looking to buy a home, I'm going to have a dedicated amount that I'm putting in a account for that down payment for that home someday. If I've got kids, I might be allocating some amount for their education expenses later on. Or if I want to have an opportunity fund to buy into a practice or start my own, I'm going to have a separate fund, right? And then when I finally get down to the end of my budget, right, that's what's going to determine how much I have left for other things, right? So in that budget, I'm going to have my save minimum monthly payment, right? That's kind of the minimum I know I have to pay, right? But everything else, if I want it to happen, I'm going to have to work it into my budget, right? And if it turns out I can bump that investing amount from 10 to 15% up to 20 to 25% by keeping my student loan payment pegged to my income using a plan like Save, and you want to choose to do that, then absolutely. I think you will come out ahead in the long run by doing that, right? But that month, keeping that payment pegged to your save, keeping your student loan payment pegged to your income is just one part of that overall equation. All right, Katie ran a simulator link and she thinks Save it is. Perfect. That's exactly. And if you want, some help with that, you can hit the Save Share button, post it on the message boards, and we can review that link with you and see if we have anything we can tweak and make it more accurate. Is there a salary cap for the income-based repayment plans? There is not, right? So especially the Save plan, you can, if you earn $1 million a year on your tax return, your payment will be, using that $1 million a year, a percentage of that $1 million per year. Right now, if you use, well, I don't even want to get into that, but there are a couple of other income-driven plans that will cap your payment at the fixed 10-year plan amount, right? Once your income exceeds a certain level. But these are, again, congratulations when you hit those. Oh God, my loan servicers, I hate loan servicer questions. Okay, sorry. Can and should I switch all of them under Mohila? Look, all of the loan servicers are terrible. They're absolutely terrible. They make this worse than it needs to be. If you consolidate, or if you're going to use public service loan forgiveness, your loan servicer should be Mohila, because they are the official monitor of public service loan forgiveness. They are terrible too. There's just, it just is. But if you're going to have to choose one, you would rather have one than two. One terrible servicer is always better than two terrible different servicers. And if you have to choose one, choose Mohila, because if you ever end up working towards public service loan forgiveness, they will move your loans to Mohila anyway. And mistakes get made when your loans get moved. So that's why we recommend Mohila, not because they're good and they're going to make your life easy, but just because they monitor public service loan forgiveness. Right? And we want to keep your loan moving to a minimum. Right? Now, hopefully they're going to have to get better, because public service loan forgiveness requires you to use an income-driven plan. So theoretically, Mohila should get better at administering the income-driven plans, but right now they're all terrible. And another reason why you really just kind of need to have some base level knowledge of how this stuff works, so you can combat the utter BS you're going to hear from your loan servicers. Can Parent Plus loans qualify for Save as well? It depends on who you believe. There are some loophole processes that are floating around in the back corners of the interwebs that I have never tried. You're welcome to give it a go. They're very, very, very complicated. Theoretically, if you do them right, you can get a Parent Plus loan to qualify for Save. chances are it may not work out well. If you can't get it into save, you can still use what's called the income contingent repayment plan. So if your parents are, living on a fixed income or otherwise have a lower income, there is an income plan available for them. It's called ICR, but it's the only income-driven plan that you can use for a Parent Plus loan, if it's helpful. Otherwise, you may want to, research some of these bizarro double consolidation loopholes to try to get those Parent Plus loans into save. That's not something that I recommend ever, just because, again, I kind of suspect it's a little off.
Yeah, I don't follow those very closely either. I know of them. But my understanding is some of those loopholes are closing as well, as of July 1, 2024. So you can look into it, but I'm not sure if that option will still be available.
Glenn is pointing out, if your parents claim you as a dependent and you file a tax return, make sure you don't claim yourself as a dependent, or it will create a problem. Okay, that's great. That is great advice. Thank you, Glenn. What is the downside of consolidating? Yeah, there are a lot more pros than cons. The one con is it will capitalize your unpaid interest. That's it. So if right now, that generally doesn't have any financial consequences. However, when we start seeing graduates with $30, $40, $50, $60, $70,000 of unpaid interest, it may start to have some financial consequences, right? But capitalizing your unpaid interest is not something you should avoid right now if you could otherwise use the benefits, the pros that we've been talking about with consolidation. Okay, if your employer was paying towards your student loans for a period of time and you were in a time-driven plan, can you switch later to an income-driven plan? You can certainly do that, but you're going to end up paying more towards your student loans, right? And there's probably a sweet spot somewhere there where if your loans are low enough where the difference between a 25 or 30 year extended minimum monthly payment is not so different than a save minimum monthly payment, then that could potentially be helpful. But in most cases, if we're talking about using a time-driven plan over an income-driven plan so you can get that employer payment to potentially hit the principal, we're talking about significantly increasing your minimum monthly payment, which is generally not helpful for the borrower. Right, so you can do all of these, and that's unfortunately what a lot of there's usually third-party companies that help these employers set these plans up, and that's generally what they tell them to do. Right, they're like, hey, well, if you can get your associate to use a time-driven plan, then your payments will count and hit the principal. And it's like, okay, great. Well, that means that the associate's minimum monthly payment is now $2,500 a month higher than it would be using the save plan. Congratulations, right? I mean, that's not that helpful, right? So there are ways where the employer can get that payment to actually count, i.e. hit the principal, but it may not be helpful for you, right? So the only time I would maybe flirt with that is if, again, the time-driven extended payment would be similar to what your, income-driven plan payment would be. But, we would have to really do some diving in to see what that would look like. What is a decent interest rate on private student loans that you've seen? I have about 30,000 at 15%, wondering if I should look at refinancing. Yeah, that's not great, right? But again, you're gonna have a very hard time refinancing a private student loan as a student, right? You can certainly shop around, go out there and look. There's a bazillion sites out there that will be glad to refinance your private student loan. You might even start with your current bank or walk into a local credit union or something and see what kind of rates that they may offer you. But you should be able to get, if you had good credit, you should be able to get something now, a fixed rate on a student loan at maybe 10 or 15 years, something between, I don't know, 7 and 9, 10%. So, but as a student, you're probably not going to get a very good offer, right? So you're going to want to wait until you're done being a student and maybe have some consistent income to show. Can you consolidate older loans while they are in deferment? Yes. So deferment is a status that allows you to consolidate your loans, right? The in school is the one that doesn't let you consolidate them. Wow. Cool. Well, we made it through all the questions.
The end of the question barrel.
I know, and there's still 40 people here. Wow, you guys are gluttons for punishment. No, I appreciate you guys sticking around. Alexia, thank you too for sticking around. I know this is way longer than we had initially billed, but we, especially with all the changes going on, I generally try to get through everybody's questions to make sure they have an opportunity to get our take on it.
Yeah, so thank you, SAFMA, for helping to host this. We really appreciate it. And Alexia, thank you for hanging out with us.
Thank you so much for presenting. It was super helpful and very informative as always. So we appreciate it.
Very cool. Well, yeah. Well, thanks everyone, and thank you, Becca, and for moderating the questions. And if anybody needs some additional assistance, right, come find us over on the student debt message board area, particularly if you want to try your hat at any of the mad scientist scenarios that we presented tonight. So we'll be looking forward to seeing if we can make those helpful for you guys.
There were a couple of comments from people who somebody even asked, how do I let you know that I'm in the mad scientist scenario? And I said, you can just say that. We'll go from there.
Yeah.
We've already gotten about 3 emails saying that. So.
Oh, great. Perfect.
Well, perfect. Well, thanks, Tony.
Yeah, that was one of the goals for tonight, to find some more guinea pigs. So excellent.
Awesome. We'll have that follow-up email out in the next couple of days with the recording, the link to Tony's Prezi, all of the links in there, as well as some additional information. Thanks everyone so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thanks everyone.